She was pushed into the center of the room, while 200 people watched and waited for her to fall apart. Her cousin's voice cut through the music like a blade-sharp, deliberate design to wound. Since Eleanor claims she understands people better than books, perhaps she should test herself on the man everyone fears. The laughter came immediately. All around her silk gowns rustled, and champagne glasses caught candlelight, and every single face in that glittering room turned toward the one man sitting alone at the far end of the hall. Lord Adrian Blackthorne, the Duke everyone called a monster. Chate. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and stay until the end of this story. Comment which city you are watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Eleanor Whitmore had spent 27 years learning how to disappear. It was a skill, really. Not something she had been born with, but something she had practiced and refined the way other women practiced piano or watercolor. She knew exactly how to stand at the edge of a conversation without entering it. She knew how to smile in a way that was polite without being memorable. She knew how to make herself useful enough that people kept her around, and quiet enough that they never felt threatened by her presence. She was in the language her cousin Clara had used on more than one occasion, perfectly adequate. That was supposed to be an insult. Eleanor had stopped feeling it as one somewhere around age 22. By now, perfectly adequate felt like a shield. The Ravenshire Winter Banquet was not a place for someone perfectly adequate to attend. It was the most significant social gathering of the season. A display of wealth and bloodlines and carefully negotiated alliances dressed up in brocade and candlelight. The invitations went out 6 weeks in advance and were discussed in every drawing room in the county. To receive one was a statement. To be seen there was a confirmation. Eleanor had not received an invitation. She had come because Clara had needed her. This was not unusual. Clara needed her frequently, in the way that someone with 20 gowns needs someone else to decide which one to wear. Clara was beautiful in the way that seemed almost effortless. Tall, fair, with the kind of copper hair that caught light in every season, and she had grown up in a world that rewarded that particular kind of beauty with attention and status, and a generous interpretation of every flaw. She was not intentionally cruel. Eleanor had decided this years ago, and mostly believed it. Clara simply did not think very carefully about other people's feelings because she had never been required to. Tonight she had required Eleanor to help her dress, to advise on her jewelry, to confirm 3 times that her entrance to the ballroom was perfectly timed, and then to stand 2 steps behind her like a particularly well-dressed shadow. Eleanor had done all of this because the bookshop needed saving. Her father's bookshop, the narrow, slightly crooked building on the corner of Whitmore Lane, where she had grown up, surrounded by the smell of old paper and leather binding, was 3 months behind on its debts. Her father had been gone for 2 years now, and the shop had passed to her by default, along with every obligation attached to it. She had been making ends meet by taking private restoration work wealthy families who had inherited damaged historical documents, old letters, crumbling ledgers, and doing careful, meticulous repair work that most people did not know how to value. She was exceptionally good at her work. Nobody except the documents themselves ever acknowledged this. Clara had promised that if Eleanor attended the banquet and helped manage the evening, she would speak to her husband about extending a small loan. Just enough. Just enough to keep the shop open another season, while Eleanor found more work. So Eleanor had come. She had worn her best dress, which was 4 years old, but still respectable, and she had spent the evening doing exactly what she always did at gatherings like this, staying close enough to be helpful and far enough away to be invisible. She had been managing it successfully. Until Clara found her at the edge of the dessert table. Clara was flushed with champagne, and the specific kind of social triumph that comes from having been admired by the right people at the right moment. She was in that particular mood. Eleanor recognized it, had seen it dozens of times, where the world felt generous, and she wanted to share that feeling by entertaining the people around her. Eleanor was sometimes useful for this too. There she is. Clara slipped her arm through Eleanor's and turned her gently but firmly toward the center of the room. Come, I want to introduce you to Lady Hargrove. Lady Hargrove was standing in a cluster of women near the fireplace. She was perhaps 50, dressed in deep green, with the expression of someone who collected other people's embarrassments as a hobby. "Lady Hargrove," Clara said brightly, "this is my cousin Eleanor. She is wonderfully clever with old things." Old things. Lady Hargrove looked at Eleanor the way one might look at an interesting piece of furniture. "What sort of old things?" "Documents, letters, historical records." Eleanor kept her voice even. "I do restoration work." "How terribly useful." Lady Hargrove's attention had already begun to drift. "I suppose someone must." This was where Eleanor usually found a way to step back gracefully to let the conversation move on without her. But Clara's grip on her arm tightened just slightly, and Eleanor recognized something shifting in the room around them. A gathering of attention, a movement of bodies. The specific change in energy that happens when people sense an opportunity for entertainment. "Do you know," Clara said, tilting her head with a thoughtful expression that Eleanor recognized immediately as the opposite of thoughtful. Eleanor is always claiming that she understands people. She says it all the time that books are just people really, that all the human heart needs is careful study. "I have never said that," Eleanor said quietly. Clara laughed. "She is too modest." She glanced around at the small circle that had formed, then raised her voice just enough. "Since Eleanor claims she understands people better than books, perhaps she should test herself on the man everyone fears." The laughter came immediately. From Lady Hargrove first, then from the women beside her, then rippling outward through the room in the way that these things do. One person laughing gives permission to the next and the next, until it becomes a sound that has its own momentum. Eleanor became very still. She knew what everyone was looking at. She had been aware of him since she entered the room in the careful peripheral way that she was aware of anything that represented a potential difficulty in a social situation. She had noted him the same way she noted narrow staircases and loose table legs, something to account for something to navigate around. Lord Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of Ravenshire, sat at the far end of the hall at a table that should have held 12 people, and instead held only him, not because there were no seats available. The room was full of seats. It was because nobody sat near him, not by accident, not by lack of opportunity, by active, deliberate choice. The tables on either side of his had slowly emptied over the course of the evening, as one by one the guests found reasons to relocate. The servants who brought his wine refilled his glass with their eyes cast down, moving quickly, retreating faster. Howe was perhaps 36, with the kind of face that had probably been considered handsome before. Whatever had happened to it, before the jaw had set hard, and the eyes had gone flat, and the entire expression had arranged itself into something that communicated without words. "Do not approach me." He was watching the room with complete attention and complete indifference simultaneously. The watching was automatic. The indifference was studied. Eleanor had thought, he does not want to be here either. Now the entire room was looking at her and at him and waiting. She understood the joke. She understood it precisely. Clara had not meant it as malice exactly, or at least that was what Eleanor would choose to believe, but as entertainment. Watch the quiet little bookworm cross the room toward the most feared man in the county. Watch her fumble. Watch her flee. Watch the Duke dismiss her with whatever cutting word he was famous for. Watch Eleanor Whitmore be put back in her proper place, which was invisible, which was behind Clara, which was not here in the middle of the room being pointed at. Eleanor took a breath. She thought about the bookshop. She thought about her father's handwriting on the labels of the shelves. The way he had always filed things by feeling, rather than category: books that change you, and books that comfort you, and books that you will return to, and how she had been maintaining that system for 2 years, because she could not bring herself to change it. She thought about how she had spent 27 years staying at the edges of rooms just like this one, being useful and invisible, and how that had protected her from certain kinds of pain, but had also left her standing exactly here in the center of everyone's amusement, with nowhere to step backward to. And then something happened inside Eleanor Whitmore that she could not entirely explain even later when she had time to examine it carefully. She lifted her chin. She crossed the room. The music had stopped. She had not noticed exactly when it happened. It might have been when Clara spoke. It might have been when the laughter spread. But by the time Eleanor was halfway across the floor, The Ravenshire winter banquet was entirely, completely silent. Every eye followed her. Her heels were quiet on the marble. Her dress was 4 years old. Her hands were perfectly steady because she made them be, which was not the same thing as them wanting to be, but was close enough. She did not look at the people watching her. She looked at the Duke. Up close, he was larger than she had estimated. His shoulders filled the chair in the way that men who carry real physical work fill chairs not decoratively, but actually. His hands were around a glass of wine he had not drunk. His expression as she approached was, she catalogued it the way she catalogued damage in a document, not hostile, not welcoming, waiting. He had seen her coming. He had been watching the room, which meant he had been watching Clara, which meant he had heard everything. Eleanor stopped 2 feet from the table. "My lord," she said. Her voice was entirely steady. "I apologize for the disruption." He looked at her for a moment. Then he set down his glass with a small, deliberate sound. He stood up. Eleanor had not expected this. She had expected, she was not entirely sure what she had expected. A dismissal. A cutting remark. A look of boredom so complete it would send her back across the room to Clara's laughter, with everything confirmed about her place in the world. She had not expected Lord Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of Ravenshire, feared by every person in this room, to stand up. He did not simply stand. He moved to the chair beside the chair on his left, which was slightly better positioned than the others, angled toward the fireplace at the end of the room, positioned where the candlelight landed warmly, and he pulled it out. He looked at her. He said, "A woman who has the courage to cross this room deserves a better seat." 200 people heard it. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. The first silence had been the held breath of people waiting for a joke to land. This silence was the held breath of people recalibrating. Eleanor sat down, not because she was sure this was the right decision, not because she had some plan for what came next, but because her legs had made the decision before her mind could argue with it, and because the alternative, turning around and walking back across that room, was something she understood clearly she could not do. The music began again, slowly, then with more confidence. The crowd returned to its conversations. Not all of it. There were still glances, still whispers, but the performance of the evening reasserted itself around them, and the focus shifted, or at least pretended to. Adrian Blackthorne sat back down. He lifted his wine glass. He said nothing. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap and said nothing either. This lasted perhaps 30 seconds, which felt considerably longer. "You do not need to stay," he said. He was not looking at her. He was watching the room the same way he had been before she arrived. "The point has been made." "What point?" "That you were braver than everyone expected." He took a small sip of wine. "You have demonstrated it. You may go back." "I don't particularly want to go back," Eleanor said. This was true. She was not entirely sure where the truth of it had come from, but it was there, clear and unambiguous. The thought of returning to Clara's side, of what Clara's expression would do when she saw Eleanor return so quickly, of the particular quality of the congratulations she would receive. "Well done. You nearly managed." It was more uncomfortable than sitting in silence beside the most feared man in the county. Adrian Blackthorne turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were gray. Not the soft gray of morning clouds, but darker, the gray of a sky that has made up its mind about the weather. There was nothing hostile in them at this particular moment. There was something that she classified tentatively as surprise. "Most people," he said, "find reasons to leave within 30 seconds. You timed it. After the first year you begin to notice patterns." Eleanor considered this. "That must be very isolating." "It is very peaceful." She looked at the empty tables around them, the careful, empty circle that the rest of the party had maintained around his position all evening. "Is that what this is, peace?" He turned back to the room. "It is what I choose to call it." "That is a very good strategy," Eleanor said. "Renaming things you cannot change so they feel chosen rather than imposed." There was another silence, shorter this time. "You repair old documents," he said. It was not a question. He had heard Clara's introduction then, had been listening. "Yes." "Damaged ones." Primarily. Families bring me things: letters, ledgers, estate records that have deteriorated. Water damage, fire damage, simple age. I consolidate the material, repair the binding where possible, stabilize what cannot be fully repaired. And you are good at it. I am very good at it, Eleanor said, because it was true, and because in this particular moment with this particular man, something in the air suggested that false modesty would be noticed and would be contemptible. The faintest thing moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The consideration of a smile, perhaps. Your cousin implied you were mostly theoretical. My cousin measures usefulness by the size of the drawing room it occurs in. Eleanor paused. That was unkind. I should not have said it. Why not? It appeared to be accurate. Because she is still family, and I will have to explain myself to her tomorrow morning, and it is easier to do that if I have not said everything I was thinking tonight. This time, the almost smile was slightly more definite. Practical. I have to be. The Duke set his wine glass down and turned to look at her more fully, and Eleanor had the sudden distinct impression of being examined, not the way men usually examined women. At events like this, measuring beauty and status and marriageability, but the way she examined a damaged document, with attention, with something that was trying to determine the nature and extent of what it was seeing. Why did you come over? He asked. The real reason, not the courage narrative everyone will tell about tonight. Eleanor thought about this for a moment. Because you were sitting alone, she said finally, and everyone had decided why before finding out. He looked at her. That seemed, she continued, unkind. And I have had some experience with people deciding things about me before finding out. The room moved around them. Candles burned. Somewhere a string quartet had resumed a waltz. Clara was somewhere behind her. Eleanor could feel it without looking the direction of that particular pointed attention, but she did not look back. What do they decide about you? He asked. That I am quiet, that I am plain, that I am useful for certain purposes and unremarkable for everything else. She paused. That I am the sort of person you invite to events in the role of assistant rather than guest. And is any of that true? She considered it honestly. The quiet part sometimes. The plain part depends on the light. The useful part is true, but not in the way they mean it. She looked at him. What do they decide about you? That I destroyed my own family. That I am without compassion. That I am to be avoided. He said it flatly, the way one reads off a list. That sitting near me is a social liability. And is any of that true? He looked at her for a long moment. The part about sitting near me, he said. That part has some history to it. It was not a confession. It was not quite a deflection either. It was something in between, a door left slightly open that she was not sure she had been invited through. She decided not to push it. I should tell you, she said instead, that I am going to have a fairly difficult morning tomorrow. My cousin will be unhappy with how this evening ended. She arranged your humiliation, he said without particular heat. She does not deserve your concern. No, but she has something I need. Eleanor looked at her hands. My father's bookshop. It is there are debts. She offered to help if I helped her manage this evening. And you managed it, he said. Differently than she intended, but you managed it. I think she may disagree. Then she is wrong. He said it simply without emphasis, in the tone of a man accustomed to saying simple things that other people found difficult to believe. You walked across a room that every person here was afraid to cross. You sat down. You spoke honestly. He paused. That is not a failure. That is the only interesting thing that has happened in this room tonight. Eleanor looked at him. In 27 years of being perfectly adequate, she had been called many things. Useful, quiet, clever in a small way, kind in a manageable way, sensible, modest, undemanding. She had never been called interesting by someone who seemed to mean it. She did not know what to do with it exactly. She filed it away, the way she filed information she needed time to examine properly. You should know, she said, that I did not cross the room to be interesting. I crossed it because everyone in this hall has already decided who you are, and it seemed to me that you had been sitting alone all evening with no one considering whether they might be wrong. He watched her. Were they wrong? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I have given them reasons for their conclusions. That is not the same thing as the conclusions being correct. The string quartet had moved into something slower. The candles had burned lower. Around the party had shifted into the later hours of itself, louder, warmer, the social performances becoming more relaxed as the champagne accumulated. People had stopped watching them so actively. They had become paradoxically part of the background of the evening. "Your shop?" he said. "What is owed?" Eleanor blinked. "I beg your pardon. The bookshop. What are the debts?" She stiffened, and she was aware of herself stiffening, and she did not entirely succeed at stopping it. "That is not. I was not telling you to solicit assistance." "I know that." He was looking at the room again. "I am asking because it is relevant information. It is not relevant to you. Perhaps I decide what is relevant to me." There was a brief silence, in which Eleanor attempted to arrange her thoughts into something coherent. "My lord, I sat down at your table to offer you the consideration of a stranger who assumed you might be a human being. I did not come to present a financial situation. And I am sitting at this table because 200 people have decided I am to be avoided, and I have given up arguing the point." He turned to look at her one more time. "You said you have experience with people deciding things before finding out. So do I. You also said you are useful in ways people do not measure properly. I am in a position to agree with that assessment more thoughtfully than your cousin." Eleanor looked at him. She was very good at reading documents. She had spent years learning to see past the damage to the structure beneath, to identify what was original and what was later addition, what was authentic and what had been obscured by time or accident or someone else's choices. The man sitting across from her had a great deal of damage. Some of it was visible. Some of it she suspected she had only barely begun to see the edge of. But beneath it, she was not sure exactly. She was sure that she was not sure which was different from certainty in either direction. "I think," she said carefully, "that it would be a mistake to make any decisions tonight." "Agreed." He refilled her wine glass, then his own. "But I would like you to consider that not all of them need to be made tonight." He did not say anything else. The evening moved around them, the music and the candlelight and the careful social machinery of the Ravenshire winter banquet, doing what it had always done, which was to maintain itself regardless of the smaller dramas occurring within it. Eleanor Whitmore sat in the finest chair in the room beside the man that no one dared approach and thought about damaged things and hidden structures, and how sometimes the most important information in a document was what had been deliberately removed rather than what remained. She was still thinking about it when Clara appeared at her elbow. 2 hours later, champagne flushed, and with an expression she could not quite place. Part confusion, part something that might have been reluctant admiration, and underneath both of those, the specific discomfort of someone whose joke has not landed in the direction intended. "We are leaving," Clara said. Eleanor set down her glass and rose and smoothed her skirts in the familiar practiced way. She turned to make her farewell to the Duke. He had already stood. He inclined his head toward her with a formality that was entirely genuine and not at all performative, which made it she registered unusual. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "My lord." She crossed back through the room, the same marble, the same candles, and this time nobody laughed. Several people looked. Some of them looked uncertain. One or two looked as though they were revising something privately. Clara caught up with her at the entrance and took her arm and said in a low voice that was trying for lightness and not quite achieving it, "Well, that was unexpected." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "What did you talk about?" "Books," Eleanor said. "Mostly." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "He was not what I expected." "No," Eleanor said. "I do not think he is what anyone expects." The carriage was waiting. The night was cold and very clear. Eleanor sat back against the cushions and looked out at the dark shapes of the Ravenshire countryside moving past the window. In her mind, she was already cataloging what she had observed. Not organizing it yet, there was too much she did not understand for organizing, but marking the pieces that might matter. The empty tables, the servant's eyes, the glass of wine he had not drunk, the way he said peaceful when he meant something else entirely, the almost smile, the thing he had said about reasons and conclusions not being the same. She was a woman who repaired broken things. She was very good at it. She had learned to see damage without flinching, to sit with things that were in terrible condition and ask patiently what they had once been before they became what they were now. She fell asleep in the carriage somewhere between Ravenshire and home, and the last thing she was thinking about was not Clara and not the loan and not the bookshop debt. She was thinking about a man sitting alone at a table that 200 people had decided to leave empty, and the way he had looked at her, not like she was plain, not like she was adequate, not like she was useful in a small and manageable way, like she was the only interesting thing in the room. And how she thought in 27 years of being perfectly adequate, she had never once understood what it would feel like to be found interesting. It felt, she decided, like finding a page you had not known was missing. Eleanor did not hear from Clara about the loan the next morning, or the morning after that. By the third day, she had stopped waiting and returned to her work, a set of 18th-century parish records belonging to the Hargrove family that had arrived wrapped in oilcloth and smelling of a flood that had happened sometime in the previous decade. The damage was extensive, but not irreparable. Most damage was not irreparable in Eleanor's experience. It simply required patience and the willingness to sit with something broken long enough to understand how it had broken. She worked at the large table in the back of the bookshop, where the light came through two small windows in the afternoon and fell at exactly the right angle for close work. She had cleared a section of shelves and arranged her tools with the precision her father had taught her. The bone folders and soft brushes, the Japanese tissue paper, the wheat starch paste. She mixed fresh each morning, the small weights she used to hold things flat while they dried. She did not think about the banquet. She thought about it constantly. This was, she recognized, a contradiction she had no immediate solution for. She was very practiced at managing contradictions. She set the Hargrove records aside when the light went, and made tea, and sat in her father's chair, which was not her chair, and had never quite become her chair, despite 2 years of occupying it, and permitted herself in the specific quiet of the shop after closing to think about the one thing she had been not thinking about all day. The Duke had not been what she expected. This was both a simple observation and a complicated one. She had expected hostility or inference. She had been sent to him as a humiliation after all, and a man of his reputation would have every right to treat her as exactly what Clara had intended her to be. She had prepared herself for dismissal. She had made peace with it somewhere on the walk across that room, tucking the anticipated hurt away in the place where she kept other anticipated hurts, the small organized shelf of rejections she had learned not to feel too immediately. What she had not prepared herself for was the chair, not even the compliment attached to it. A woman who has the courage to cross this room deserves a better seat, but the gesture itself, the standing, the moving, the deliberate choice to acknowledge her arrival in a way that could be seen by everyone in the room, when a man of his position and temperament could easily have looked at her approach with the kind of flat indifference that would have sent her retreating in 30 seconds, as he had implied was standard. He had chosen not to. She was still turning this over when the knock came at the shop door. It was a woman she did not recognize, older, perhaps 60, with the upright posture of someone who had spent a lifetime being observed and had made peace with it. She was dressed well, but not extravagantly. Her eyes were sharp and kind in equal measure, which Eleanor found immediately interesting as a combination. "Miss Whitmore," the woman said. "Yes. My name is Lady Margaret Blackthorne. I am Lord Adrian's aunt." She paused, assessing Eleanor's expression with the efficiency of someone who does a great deal of assessing. "I wonder if I might come in." Lady Margaret did not sit down immediately. She walked along the shelves first slowly with genuine attention, touching nothing but looking carefully at everything. Eleanor watched her do this and said nothing because she recognized the behavior. It was what people did when they were trying to understand something from the inside out. "Your father's shop," Lady Margaret said finally. "Yes, I remember it, from years ago. He had a particular talent for finding things." She stopped at a section near the window. He found a copy of a Flemish botanical atlas for my husband, considered lost apparently. He simply wrote that he had come across it and wondered if we had any interest. She smiled, not quite at Eleanor, but at something behind Eleanor's eyes. We did. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. The specific movement of grief that happened when someone else remembered her father with accuracy. He had a gift for that. He never really sold books. He found them homes. He did. Lady Margaret turned and looked at her directly. You have his eyes. And from what I understand, something of his instinct. She moved toward the chair Eleanor indicated, sat down with the economy of movement of someone who did not waste gestures, and folded her hands. I want to offer you work, Miss Whitmore. Eleanor sat down across from her. What kind of work? The kind you are already very good at. Lady Margaret's gaze was steady. Ravenshire Castle contains in its lower archives several thousand documents in various states of deterioration. Estate records, family correspondence, historical deeds going back 3 centuries. My nephew has had little opportunity to attend to them properly. I would like to engage someone to assess the damage and undertake what restoration is possible. Eleanor looked at her hands. That is a significant undertaking. Yes. For a significant collection. Yes. It would take months. I am aware. My lord the Duke would need to agree to having someone in the archives on an extended basis, Eleanor said carefully. He has agreed, Lady Margaret said without hesitation. Something in Eleanor's expression must have shifted, because Lady Margaret's own expression did something small and precise, not quite a smile, but the careful management of one. There is also, Lady Margaret continued, her tone unchanged, another matter, not unrelated but distinct. She paused, and for the first time, something in the efficient composure showed a fine line of what Eleanor recognized as genuine worry. My nephew has a ward, his brother's son. Oliver is 8 years old. Eleanor waited. Oliver lost both his parents 18 months ago, Lady Margaret said. He has been at Ravenshire since then. He was a bright, lively child, very much his mother's spirit. The fine line deepened slightly. Since arriving at the castle, he has stopped speaking. Not physically unable, the physician confirms. There is no physical cause. He simply does not speak. Not to the servants, not to the tutors we have engaged, not to me, and, she paused again, not to Adrian. How does your nephew respond to that? With tremendous pain, he goes to considerable lengths to hide, Lady Margaret said simply. He blames himself. He has engaged 3 governesses, 2 tutors, a physician from London, and a man who was described to us as an expert in childhood grief. Oliver has sat through all of them in complete silence and remained in every meaningful sense alone. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. You want me to try, she said. I want you to come to Ravenshire to restore the documents, Lady Margaret said precisely. The boy is not your responsibility. I am not engaging you as a companion or a therapist. But I have observed in my experience that certain people create a particular quality of quiet around them. A kind of patience that children, especially wounded children, can sense before they can reason about it. She looked at Eleanor directly. You have it. I noticed it the moment I came through that door, and you waited for me to finish looking at the shelves before you spoke. Eleanor said nothing. The document work is real, and it is valued, and it will be paid for properly, Lady Margaret said. What happens beyond that, if anything, is simply what happens. She opened her hands, a gesture that managed to be both precise and generous. I thought you deserved to know both things before you decided. Eleanor agreed to come on a Thursday. She spent the 2 days between the conversation and her arrival organizing the shop, closing it properly, leaving instructions with the woman next door, who took in sewing and had kept an eye on the building during her father's final illness. She packed her tools with the same care she always did, each one wrapped in soft cloth, the papers and adhesives sorted and labeled. She packed 3 dresses, her most comfortable boots, and the book she was currently reading, which was a history of papermaking in medieval Europe, and which she found genuinely compelling. She did not pack anything decorative. She was going to work. She told herself this firmly more than once. Ravenshire Castle presented itself from the carriage window, First, as a silhouette towers against a gray December sky, the outline of something very old and very serious. Then the carriage turned through the gates, and it became less abstract, stone walls with the particular texture of centuries, tall windows that caught the thin afternoon light, grounds that had once been formal gardens, and now were maintained, but not flourishing, as though they were being preserved rather than truly tended. Eleanor observed all of this with the part of her mind that catalogued damage. The outside was impressive. The inside, when Thomas Vale, the estate manager, a quiet man of perhaps 50, with watchful eyes and a manner that communicated total competence and no wasted words, showed her through the entrance hall, told a different story. The entrance hall itself was beautiful. High ceilings, a staircase that curved upward with genuine grace, stone floors that had been laid with care and maintained with attention. But the things that should have made it feel inhabited were wrong. The flowers that would have stood in the great vase near the stairs were absent. The vase was there, cleaned, simply empty. The doors to rooms on either side of the corridor were closed. Not locked, she thought, but shut in the way that rooms get shut when the people who opened them are no longer there. Family portraits lined the upper portion of the entrance wall. 3 of them were covered. Not removed, covered with gray cloth, the frames visible at the edges. Someone had done it with care. Someone had not been able to take them down entirely. Thomas Vale caught her looking and said nothing, but she felt his attention shift slightly in the way attention shifts when something has been noticed that is usually not mentioned. "The archives are in the East Wing," he said. "I will show you to your room first if you like, and then the workspace." "The archives first," Eleanor said. "Please." The smallest possible thing happened at the corner of Thomas Vale's mouth. "Yes, miss." The archives were extraordinary. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a moment, with the specific feeling she always got when confronted with a collection that had been neglected by time rather than carelessness. A collection that had once been someone's devotion and had then been overtaken by the more immediate demands of living. Floor-to-ceiling shelving on 3 walls. Document boxes, ledgers, letter bundles. Some of it carefully organized, labeled in hands from different centuries. Some of it simply accumulated, piled in the organic way that things pile when there are more important things to attend to. A large window on the north wall let in cool, steady light. Exactly right. There was water damage along the lower shelves on the east wall. Old, she thought, probably a flooding incident from 20 or 30 years ago. Not recent. Some mold damage in the corner. The boxes nearest the floor would need to be assessed first. She was already planning the order of approach in her mind, already sorting by priority, already thinking about which materials she would need beyond what she had brought when she became aware that she was not alone. The boy was sitting on the floor in the corner behind the door. How was small for 8? Or perhaps he simply sat in a way that made him seem small, knees drawn up back against the shelving, a book open in his lap that he was not reading. He was looking at her. His eyes were very dark, very direct, and entirely without expression. Not unfriendly exactly, but sealed in the way that something is sealed when it has learned that staying sealed is safer than opening. Eleanor did not exclaim. She did not immediately smile or move toward him or speak in the particular elevated tone that adults use with children when they are trying very hard to be received well. She looked at the room. Then she looked at him. "Good afternoon," she said. Normal voice. Normal volume. The voice she used when addressing anyone. He looked at her. "I am going to be working in here," she said. "I restore old documents, damaged ones. I do it quietly mostly. I sometimes talk to myself when I am thinking, but I will try to keep that to a minimum." She turned back to the shelves. "You do not need to move. There is plenty of room." She heard nothing behind her. No movement, no response. She began to work. She started with the assessment, moving along the shelves methodically, making notes in the small leather book she kept for this purpose, recording the location and nature of damage for each section. It took approximately 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, she was aware with the peripheral attention she had developed over years of working in other people's houses that the boy did not leave. She could hear him breathing. Occasionally she heard the faint sound of a page turning, which meant he had gone back to his book. She did not look at him. When she had finished the initial assessment, She sat down at the large table in the center of the room and opened the supply case and laid out her tools in their proper order. She took out one of the simpler damaged ledgers, late 18th century minor water staining on the cover interior pages intact, and began the first stage of cleaning. After a while, she said without looking up, "This is called consolidation. When something is damaged, the first thing you do is not repair it. You stabilize it. You stop the damage from getting worse before you try to fix anything." She worked the soft brush along the edge of the cover. Most people want to go straight to the fixing. It never works well. Silence. She continued working. 10 minutes later, she heard a small sound from the corner. Not quite movement. Not quite a word. Just the faint shift of someone adjusting their position. The particular sound of someone who has decided tentatively not to leave. She did not respond to it. She continued working. She did not see the Duke until the second day. Dinner on the first evening was a quiet affair. She ate in a small room off the kitchen at Lady Margaret's suggestion, which she gathered was a temporary arrangement until a more permanent one was established. Lady Margaret joined her briefly and asked about the archive assessment with genuine interest and specificity. Thomas Vale appeared at intervals to ensure things were in order. The household staff were efficient, and Eleanor noticed, careful moving with the particular precision of people who had learned to keep things running smoothly without drawing attention to themselves. The castle was very quiet at night. She lay in her room, a comfortable room better than she had expected, with a window that faced east and would get the morning light, and listened to the quiet, and thought about the boy. Oliver had stayed in the archives for 3 hours. He had not spoken. He had not interacted with her in any direct sense. But when Thomas Vale had appeared in the doorway at 5 o'clock to indicate that dinner would be shortly, Oliver had looked at Eleanor with those dark sealed eyes, and there had been something, the faintest adjustment, like a small shift in the weather before he got up and left. Eleanor thought about what Lady Margaret had said. Certain people create a particular quality of quiet around them. She had never thought of her quietness as a gift before. She had thought of it as a consequence, the particular adaptation of someone who learned early that taking up space created problems. But perhaps she thought it was not one thing or the other. Perhaps the distinction between a wound and a skill depended in some cases on where you stood when you looked at it. She fell asleep thinking about the covered portraits in the entrance hall. The Duke appeared at the archive door the following morning at approximately 10 o'clock. Eleanor had arrived at 7. She worked best in the early hours and had been deep in the first serious restoration session when she heard footsteps in the corridor that were not Thomas Vale's measured tread or the lighter step of the housemaid who occasionally brought tea. These were different. Deliberate, but not efficient. The footsteps of someone who was deciding with each step whether to continue. She did not look up from the document she was working on. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "My lord." She finished the section she was consolidating before setting down her brush. Then she looked up. Howe was standing in the doorway. Not entering. Standing in the doorway, which she noted because it was a choice, a specific spatial decision that said something about the person making it. He was dressed more practically than at the banquet. Dark coat, no formal trappings, and he looked like what he actually was, a man who managed a large estate and carried a great deal of weight, and was not sure in this particular moment where to put it. His eyes moved around the room, taking in her arrangement of the workspace, the organized tools, the careful labeling she had already begun on the shelves and then settled on her. "Thomas tells me you were here at 7, he said. "The morning light is useful. He also tells me Oliver was in here for 3 hours yesterday." Eleanor turned back to her work. "He was reading. He found a quiet place to do it. I did not disturb him." A pause. "He has not spent 3 hours in any room voluntarily since he arrived." "He chose the location," Eleanor said. "I simply did not make it a problem." She heard the Duke take a breath, a slow, deliberate breath, the kind that means something is being managed internally. "I want you to know," he said, "that this arrangement, what my aunt has described as the document work, is genuine. I am not using it as a pretense." "I know," Eleanor said. "I can see the archive. No one would invent this much damage as a pretense. That would require an unusual dedication to the deception." She heard it again. The thing that was almost a sound, almost a response to humor. The brief shift in the quality of his silence that she had noticed at the banquet and recognized now. The lower east shelving is the most urgent, she said. There is mold damage that needs to be addressed before I can safely access those boxes. I have sent a note to Thomas with the materials I will need. I hope that is not irregular. It is not irregular, he said. Whatever you need. Thank you. Another pause. She was aware of him still in the doorway, neither entering nor leaving, occupying the uncertain space between those two decisions. You said something at the banquet, he said. About damage and structure. About how you look for what something was before it became what it is. She looked up. His expression had the careful flatness of someone saying something they have been thinking about for several days and have arranged into the least vulnerable possible form. I have been considering it, he said. That approach. Eleanor looked at him steadily. It takes patience, she said. And you have to be willing to find things you did not expect to find. Such as, sometimes the damage is worse than it appeared. Sometimes the structure beneath is stronger than you thought. She held his gaze. Usually both things are true at the same time. He nodded, not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. The nod of someone filing something away. My aunt will show you the east grounds if you need air during the day, he said, the formality returning the door swinging back toward shut. The library on the second floor is available to you. Thomas will know where to direct any requests. Thank you, my lord. He looked at the room one more time. At the careful order she had created in the chaos, the labeled sections, the stabilized documents in their new housing. Something moved through his expression too briefly for her to name it. It looks different in here, he said. It will take time, Eleanor said. He looked at her. She had the feeling again of being examined with the careful attention of someone who is trying to see past the surface. Or perhaps not past it, through it, to the structure beneath. Yes, he said quietly. I expect it will. He left. Eleanor sat for a moment with her brush in her hand and the document in front of her and the morning light coming through the north window. Then she went back to work. By the end of the first week, a quiet shape had formed to her days at Ravenshire. Morning work in the archives. Oliver appearing usually around 9, slipping in without announcement and taking his corner with his book. Eleanor working. Neither speaking, but the silence between them changing daily, growing more comfortable, less sealed. On the fourth day, she had been repairing the spine of a 17th-century estate ledger, a delicate piece of work requiring the kind of sustained, precise attention that produced visible results slowly, when Oliver had moved from his corner and stood 2 feet away and watched. She had not reacted. She continued working, explaining in a low voice, the same voice she used when she was thinking out loud, not performing what she was doing, and why. This is the spine, she had said. It is the part that holds everything together. When it breaks, the pages become loose, and eventually you lose the order of things, they get mixed up, and it becomes difficult to understand what belongs where. She pressed the tissue paper gently along the interior joint. So I attach new support material to the inside. It becomes invisible eventually, but it is there, holding everything in the right sequence. Oliver had watched for perhaps 10 minutes. Then he returned to his corner. The next day, he came back and stood in the same place, and she gave him a pair of soft cotton gloves and let him hold one of the stable documents while she worked, and he held it with extraordinary care, with the specific seriousness of someone who understood without being told that he was trusted with something fragile. She had turned to look at him when he was focused on the document, and she had seen in his face the first unguarded expression she had witnessed there. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than happiness. Something that might be the very beginning of feeling safe. She had turned back to her work before he could see her notice. Thomas Vale found her in the archives on Friday afternoon. He was carrying a cup of tea which he set on the corner of her table, with the practicality of someone who has observed that she forgets to drink it when left to her own devices. He looked at the shelves. The progress was visible now, the east wall completely assessed, and the first section stabilized the labeling system, established the boxes reorganized in the new sequence. You move quickly, he said. I have good light in the mornings. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of someone who chose words carefully, because he had found in his experience that the right ones were worth waiting for. "The boy ate his dinner in the main dining room last night," he said. "First time since he arrived." Eleanor said nothing. "His Grace noticed," Thomas said. He did not say anything about it, but he noticed. She looked at the shelf she was relabeling. "Oliver makes his own choices. I simply try not to give him reasons to make the frightened ones." Thomas looked at her with the expression of someone confirming a previously formed conclusion. "His Grace," he said carefully, "does not find it easy to be thanked. If you were to do what you have done and expect acknowledgement from him directly, you might be disappointed." "I am not doing it to be thanked." "No," Thomas said. "I can see that." He picked up the empty teacup. "I am telling you because it is useful to understand that what looks like indifference from him is frequently not indifference. He paused. "He has learned to be very careful about what he lets himself feel grateful for, because in his experience the things he values tend to be the things that get taken from him." Eleanor looked at Thomas. He met her gaze with the steady quiet of a man who has spent years watching someone he respects suffer badly and has done what he could and knows the limits of what he can do. "I am not in a position to explain the rest," he said. "That is his to tell or not tell as he chooses." He moved toward the door. "But I thought you deserved to know that what he is not saying is not the same as what he is not feeling." He left. Eleanor sat in the archive in the afternoon light, with the hum of the work around her and the faint smell of old paper and leather that she had grown up with, and the new particular quiet of a house that was beginning very slightly to change its breathing. Outside the window, she could see the corner of the east grounds that Thomas had shown her on the first day, the gardens that were maintained but not flourishing. She had noticed something she had not mentioned to anyone yet. At the very edge of the formal garden, just past the point where the path curved toward the old wall, there was a section where something had been planted recently. The earth was newer there, darker, the plants smaller. Someone had started something. It was uncertain and tentative, and had clearly been done alone without help, in the particular way that people begin things when they are not sure they will be allowed to finish them. She had not mentioned it to anyone because she understood it. She understood it very well. She picked up her brush and went back to work. That evening, walking back from the archives toward the main house. As the light fell, Eleanor rounded a corner in the east corridor and nearly walked into the Duke. He caught her arm to steady her, one hand brief, immediately released. They stood a foot apart in the corridor. He looked, she thought, as though he had been standing in this corridor for a while, as though he had come here without entirely deciding to. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "My lord, I apologize, I was not attending." "No." He did not step back. "I was." A pause. "Oliver asked Thomas if you would be in the archives tomorrow morning." She processed this carefully. "He asked." He wrote it down. Something in Adrian's voice changed almost imperceptibly, a shift in the weight of it. "On a piece of paper. Passed it to Thomas at breakfast." He paused again. "It is the first time in 18 months that he has initiated any communication with anyone." Eleanor held herself very still. "I wanted to tell you," Adrian said, "that what you are doing—" He stopped, started differently. "I know that you are here for the archives. I know that the other is not what was agreed. But I want you to know that—" He stopped again. Thomas Vale had been right. He did not find it easy. "You do not need to say it," Eleanor said gently. He looked at her. In the corridor light, in the quiet of the evening castle, something in his expression was less managed than she had seen it before, less arranged. Something had come a little closer to the surface. "No," he said. "I think perhaps I do." He met her eyes. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore." Eleanor looked at him. This man who had spent years making sure everyone kept their distance, who had built a reputation like a wall and lived inside it, who had planted something small and uncertain in the corner of the garden and clearly not told anyone, who had stood up to pull out a chair when the easier thing and the safer thing would have been to let her walk back across the room. "You are very welcome, my lord," she said. She continued down the corridor. Behind her, she heard nothing. But she had the distinct sense, the specific sense she got sometimes with documents that had been through damage so significant that the recovery felt improbable, that something had shifted. Not repaired. Not yet. But beginning tentatively and with great care to hold. The second week at Ravenshire began with snow. Eleanor noticed it first, from the archive window. Thin, deliberate flakes falling past the glass with the unhurried quality of something that intended to stay. By mid-morning, the east grounds were white, and the garden she had been watching from a distance looked different under it. Quieter. The new planting at the edge of the path was covered, which meant whatever it was would either survive the cold or it would not, and there was nothing to be done about it now except wait and see what came back in the spring. She had learned a great deal about waiting. Oliver arrived at his usual time slightly later than her, unwinding a scarf from around his neck that was too large for him. It had clearly belonged to someone bigger, someone whose things he had inherited along with everything else. He hung it on the hook near the door that he had claimed as his hook, without either of them acknowledging that this was what it had become, and he crossed to the table where Eleanor was working. He did not go to his corner. This was new. He stood beside her and looked at the document she was working on, a set of personal letters from the 1740s, badly foxed but structurally sound, the ink faded but legible if you knew how to look. Eleanor moved slightly to the left to give him more room at the table without drawing attention to the gesture. She did not comment on this either. After a while she said in her thinking out loud voice, "Foxing is an interesting problem. Nobody is entirely certain what causes it. Some people say it is a fungus. Some say it is metal impurities in the paper reacting with humidity. What everyone agrees on is that it looks worse than it is. The brown spots seem like damage all the way through, but most of the time the paper underneath is perfectly intact." She touched the edge of a spot gently with a soft brush. "It is a surface problem that presents like a deep one." Oliver watched her brush move. "A lot of things are like that," she said quietly. She felt him look at her face. She kept her attention on the document. After a moment, he reached out and very carefully with his gloved hand touched the edge of the page. Not the foxed area. The clean edge, as though checking that it was real, that it would hold. It did. Eleanor did not remark on this. She simply continued working, and Oliver stood beside her, and the snow came down outside the window, and the archive was the warmest room in the castle. She found the ledger in the third week. She was working through the lower east, shelving the section most affected by the old flooding, systematically opening each damaged box and assessing the contents before rehousing them in new archival material. Most of what she found was what she expected: estate accounts, tenant records, correspondence about land management, and the ordinary administration of a large property across several centuries. The ledger was in the wrong box entirely. This was not unusual in itself. Documents got misfiled, especially in collections that had experienced disruption. A flood, a death in the family, a period of managed chaos when things were simply put somewhere rather than somewhere correct. But when she opened it and turned to the first page, the particular attention she had developed over years of this work sharpened immediately. It was a personal accounts book. Not an estate record, a private one. The handwriting on the inside cover, "Read property of James Blackthorne," and below that, a date from 14 years ago. She set it down. She looked at it. She set it in a separate pile marked "Family Private Advise Estate Manager," and went back to the box she had been cataloging. She thought about it for the rest of the morning. At midday, when Oliver had gone in for lunch and the archive was quiet, she sat at the large table and looked at the separate pile and thought about the covered portraits in the entrance hall. The locked rooms. The particular way Adrian's voice had changed just barely when he said his nephew's name. The garden at the edge of the east grounds, with its uncertain new planting done alone, not mentioned to anyone. She wrote a note and left it where Thomas Vale would find it. "I have found a personal account book belonging to James Blackthorne, misfiled in box 47 of the East Lower Archive. I have set it aside and have not examined it. Please advise how you wish me to proceed." She went back to work. The note reached Adrian before it reached Thomas. She did not know this until that evening when the Duke appeared in the doorway of the small sitting room, where she had taken to spending an hour before dinner, one of the volumes from the second-floor library open in her lap. A habit she had established in the second week when Lady Margaret had suggested she treat the room as her own during the evenings. He was holding her note. He looked at it, then at her. "You found it," he said. Yes, it appeared to have been shelved with estate records from a different decade entirely. Possibly during the reorganization after the flooding, things tend to get misplaced when there is urgency and not enough hands. She paused. "I have not opened it. That did not seem like my decision to make." He came into the room. He sat down in the chair across from her, not with the measured, controlled movement she had observed in him. In the first days, the careful management of how he occupied space, but with the movement of a man who has been carrying something heavy all day and no longer has the energy required to carry it elegantly. He set her note on the table between them and looked at it. "You could have read it," he said. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" She considered the question properly, because she had learned by now that he preferred that to a quick answer. Because private things should remain private until the person they belong to decides otherwise. And because whatever is in it has clearly caused you considerable pain, and I see no value in acquiring information that was not offered to me. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "James was my younger brother. He was in most respects the version of everything I tried to be done more naturally, warmer, more open. People loved him the way people love uncomplicated things." He did not say it with bitterness. He said it as a simple, accurate description. "He died 18 months ago. Oliver's mother 3 months before him." "Lady Margaret told me a little," Eleanor said gently. "What she likely did not tell you," he said, "is the shape of it." He leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, the posture of a man having a difficult conversation with a problem he has been circling for a long time. James had debts, significant ones accumulated over several years. He had made choices, I will not catalog them, that created a situation from which there was no exit that left everything intact. By the time I knew the full extent of it, the options were limited, and none of them were clean. Eleanor waited. "I tried to help him manage it quietly," he said. "He refused. He had a great deal of pride, my brother, more than was practical in the end. He wanted to resolve it himself, and he ran out of time to do so." He paused. "When it could no longer be managed quietly, I stepped in a way that from the outside, from the perspective of anyone observing, without the full information, appeared as though I had caused the problem, rather than attempted to solve it." The fire moved in the grate. "That version," he said, "is not true. The correct version would have required James's choices to become visible. Everything he had done, every decision that had brought them to that place, it would have had to be laid out in full. His name, his judgment, the image of him that Oliver carries." His jaw tightened very slightly. "He had a son. I thought that was a more important consideration than my own reputation." Eleanor sat with this. She was very good at sitting with things. "So, you allowed everyone to believe the wrong version," she said. "I encouraged the wrong version." He looked at her steadily. "It required some effort. People were inclined to assume incompetence or bad luck. I made certain the assumption that settled was the one that left James's record clean." "How long ago did this begin?" "The worst of it, the formal version. The one with social weight that dates from around the time I brought Oliver to Ravenshire." He paused. "Which was, of course, when people were already inclined to think the worst of me. It did not require much effort to push them further in that direction." Eleanor thought about the empty tables at the banquet, the careful circle of empty chairs that 200 people had maintained around him all evening. The weight of it, not just the isolation, but the knowledge that the isolation was something he had constructed deliberately, maintained deliberately as a form of protection for a child who had lost everything. "Oliver does not know," she said. "He is 8 years old. He adored his father." A pause so quiet it was almost not a pause. "He still does. I can see it in everything he does not say." He looked at the window. "Children should be allowed to love their parents fully, whatever those parents were. And when he is older, When he is older, perhaps there is a version of the truth that can be offered carefully, with context, when he is strong enough to hold it alongside everything else he knows. He paused. I am not that version of the truth. I am the one keeping it until someone more qualified decides what to do with it. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the covered portraits. She had understood them now as a form of protection, not Adrian protecting himself from grief, but Adrian protecting Oliver from questions he was not yet equipped to answer. Who are those people? Why do they look like that? Tell me about them. The portraits covered meant the questions stayed small, manageable, survivable. She thought about how much it cost to be that careful for that long alone. What is in the ledger? She asked. I don't know. I did not know it was in the archive. He turned the note over in his hands. James kept private accounts separately from the estate books. I had assumed they were either lost or had been destroyed. He paused. I did not look for them particularly. I was not certain I wanted to find them. It could be significant, Eleanor said. It could be nothing. Yes, it could also be something that matters. She looked at him directly. Would you like me to assess it? Not read it, assess it. Tell you the condition, whether the contents are intact and legible. You decide from there what to do with that information. He met her eyes. I can tell you what is preserved without telling you what it says, she said. And if you want me to look further than that, you tell me. The boundary of my work is yours to set. He was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said finally. Yes, do that. She examined the ledger the following morning before Oliver arrived. The condition was better than she had feared. Given the box, it had been misfiled and the flooding damage had not reached it, significantly likely because it had been in the wrong location, and the wrong location had by accident been a more protected one. Some moisture along the lower edge of the cover. Interior pages somewhat wavy from humidity exposure, but intact. The ink was stable. She turned pages carefully with her gloved hands, looking at the condition without reading the way she had learned to do years ago, to let her eyes move across text without absorbing it, to assess the physical state of a document without consuming its content. Then she reached the back third of the ledger, and something made her stop. Not what was there, what was not there. She could see it clearly once she was looking for it, the faint line along the inner margin where 2 pages had been removed. Cut carefully, not torn with the intention that it would not be immediately obvious. But to someone who spent her days looking at the physical integrity of documents, the absence was unmistakable. 3 pages removed cleanly somewhere in the later entries. She looked at the pages on either side of the gap. The entries before the cut ended in the middle of a financial summary. The entries after it began in a different ink, a different pen, a different pressure, with a date that was 3 months later. Someone had removed those pages deliberately. She sat back and thought about this for a long time. Then she looked more carefully at the back cover. It was thick, thicker than it should have been. She pressed it gently, felt the slight rigidity of something that was not the cover board itself. She turned it over and looked at the interior of the back cover in the light. There, the end paper had been lifted and repasted. Not perfectly, she could see the faint line where someone had worked it back down, someone who had done it with care, but without the specific training to make it invisible. She had seen this before. Documents used as concealment. Things hidden inside their own bindings by people who trusted the binding to keep secrets. She got her bone folder. She worked the edge of the end paper back with the delicacy of long practice, applying just enough pressure, moving just enough, not destructive, not irreversible, just enough to see what was underneath. A letter, folded twice, tucked between the end paper and the backboard. The paper was thinner than the ledger pages, older looking. Written in a hand she did not recognize, not James's hand which she had seen in the interior entries. A different hand, more formal, precise. She did not read it. She sat back and she breathed and she thought carefully about what she was going to do. Then she went to find Adrian. She found him in the east corridor. He was coming from the direction of the grounds. He walked the estate in the early mornings. Thomas had mentioned had done so for years, and he had the particular look of someone who had been outside in cold air and was not yet entirely back to the social version of themselves. less managed, more present. "There is something in the ledger," she said without preamble. He looked at her. "I did not read it," she said. "I want to be clear about that. But as a matter of document condition, I can tell you there are pages removed from the interior. Deliberately removed, not lost. And there is a letter concealed in the back binding." His expression did not change exactly, but something shifted behind it, a deep tectonic thing far beneath the surface. "Concealed," he said. "Hidden in the end paper. Someone put it there intentionally." She paused. "I think you should read it. Both the letter and whatever remains in the interior. I believe it may matter." She paused again. "In ways that go beyond what I currently understand." He looked at her for a moment longer than the information required. "Come with me," he said. They read it together in the archive. Eleanor had not expected this. She had expected to hand him the ledger and step away to give him the private space that she had been careful to maintain around all of this. But when she placed it in his hands in the archive and he sat down at the large table and looked at it, he looked up at her and said simply, "Please stay." So she stayed. She stood by the window and gave him the privacy of not being watched while he read. She looked at the snow on the east grounds, at the garden, with its uncertain planting, at the flat white sky. She heard the small sounds of pages turning, the careful movement of the bone folder as he worked the concealed letter free. A long silence. Then, Eleanor. It was the first time he had used her name. She turned. Howe was holding the letter. His face had done something she had not seen it do before. Not the managed flatness, not the studied control. It was simply open. Not in the way of happiness or relief. In the way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for so long that the moment it is lifted, the body does not know yet what to do with the absence of weight. "It is from his solicitor," he said. His voice was very level, the levelness of something that is maintaining itself carefully. "James went to him 3 months before he died. It is a formal statement, a witnessed statement." He paused. "He told his solicitor the full account, every detail, everything I had tried to keep out of the record." Another pause. "And he wrote a separate letter to me inside it, to be found after he knew he was unwell. He had more time than he let on." Eleanor waited. "He writes—" Adrian stopped, started again. "He says he could not allow the final version of events to stand as it stood, that he knew what I had done, what I had allowed to happen to my name. He says—" His voice changed on the final word, bent slightly under something. He looked down at the letter. He read it aloud quietly. "You were always better than I deserved in a brother. I was too proud to say it when it would have meant something. I am saying it now because it is all I have left to give you. Let them think whatever they think. You and I know the truth of it, and when Adrian is old enough, he will know it too. Tell him I am sorry, and tell my son that his father loved him whatever else he was." The archive was very quiet. Eleanor did not move. Adrian set the letter down on the table, with the careful, deliberate steadiness of someone who is managing something that could, if not managed, become very large very quickly. "He called Oliver by my name," he said. "He always did. When Oliver was born, James said he wanted his son to have a name worth something." A pause. "I did not know he meant it that way." Eleanor crossed the room and sat down across from him. Not close, the table was between them, but present. Deliberately, visibly present. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "You carried everyone's pain because you believed you deserved yours." He looked at her. "James's mistakes," she said quietly. "Oliver's grief. The estate's condition. The public version of who you are. You held all of it, and you did not put any of it down, because at some point you decided that suffering it was the correct response to having failed to prevent it." He looked at the letter. "You think I failed him," he said. "I think you believe you did," she said. "I think the truth of what you did and the story you tell yourself about it are very different documents, and you have been reading the wrong one." He was quiet for a long time. The snow outside had stopped. The light through the north window had shifted to the white brightness that comes after snowfall, when everything is still and the world has an unusual clarity. "I am tired," he said. "Just that. Two words said very quietly, with the particular weight of something that has never been said aloud before, but has been true for a very long time. Eleanor felt the truth of it in the room, like a change in temperature. "I know," she said. "I am tired of the reputation and the empty rooms and the way people stand at exactly the right distance to avoid appearing rude while making certain they never have to speak to me." He turned the letter over in his hands. "I am tired of managing Oliver's grief from across a room, because I do not know how to be near him without because everything I touch it seems has a way of—" He stopped. "That is the story again," Eleanor said gently. "The wrong one." He looked at her directly. His eyes, the dark gray of decided weather, had something in them she had not seen before. Not vulnerability exactly. Something older than vulnerability. The look of someone coming to the edge of a belief they have held so long, they stopped noticing it was a choice. "Oliver asked Thomas if you would be in the archive," she said. "He wrote it down on a piece of paper. He passed it at breakfast, after 18 months of silence." She paused. "That is what happens when you build a place safe enough for a wounded child to exist in. That is what you did. You made this castle into somewhere he could survive while he learned how to live again." She held his gaze. "You are not someone who destroys things, my lord. You are someone who has spent years making certain that the people who depended on you did not have to watch you fall apart." He looked at her for a long silent moment. "You came here," he said finally, "to restore old documents." "Yes, and somewhere along the way—" He stopped, started differently. "At the banquet, when you crossed the room, I thought—" He paused again, and she recognized the movement of someone trying to find the least defended version of a true thing. "I thought you were brave. I thought you were the most quietly brave person I had seen in a very long time, and I thought it would be the last I saw of you." "And then your aunt arrived at my door," Eleanor said. The almost smile, more definite now than she had ever seen it. "My aunt is considerably more strategic than she appears. I had begun to suspect that. She told me when she returned from your shop that she had found someone who understood the difference between what a thing looks like and what it is." He looked at the letter in his hands. "I did not understand at the time exactly what she meant. And now?" He looked at her. "You were the first person," he said, "who looked at me and searched for the man beneath the rumors, not because you intended to prove anything or because you had a reason to, but because that is simply how you look at things." A pause. "How you look at everything." Eleanor felt something settle in her chest, not the quick brightness of a compliment received, but something slower and more serious. Something that felt like being seen by someone who was paying real attention. "The man beneath the rumors," she said carefully, "is someone worth considerably more than the rumors have allowed him to demonstrate." He was quiet. "The letter," she said gently, returning them to practical ground because she could feel that this conversation had reached the edge of what either of them were ready to continue across tonight. "And the solicitor's statement. These matter. Legally, I believe they matter. Whatever is happening with your reputation, with the formal version of events, this changes what is possible." He nodded slowly. "Processing. I want to do something," she said. "With your permission, I want to go back through the full archive. Not just for condition assessment. I want to look for anything else that may have been misfiled, concealed, removed. If James went to a solicitor, if he made a formal statement, there may be other pieces. Things that were separated from where they should be intentionally or by accident." She paused. "Documents tell you the truth eventually if you are patient enough to look for all of them." He looked at her for a long moment. "You understand," he said, "that if you find things, if there are other pieces, it may not resolve quietly. Some of what is in that statement, if it became public, would require—" "I understand," she said. "I am not asking you to do anything with what I find. I am asking to find it. What happens after that is entirely your decision." He nodded. And then, without quite planning to, she was quite certain it was without planning, because she saw the exact moment it surprised him. He reached across the table and placed his hand briefly, carefully over hers. Not a romantic gesture, not a declaration. The gesture of someone communicating something for which they do not yet have adequate words. He withdrew it after a moment. "Thank you," he said. for not reading it. Of course, she said. She gathered her things and prepared to leave the archive for the evening, and she was almost at the door when he spoke again. Eleanor. She turned. He was looking at the letter again, at his brother's handwriting, at the words that had been waiting in the dark of the binding for 18 months for the right person to find them. He was right, Adrian said quietly. Whatever else he was right about that. She waited. You are worth something, he said. You have always been worth something. The people who failed to see it. He paused and something moved through his expression. Something settled, resolved old. The problem was never you. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the archive and felt something she had not felt in 27 years of being perfectly adequate. She felt it land somewhere real. Good night, my lord, she said. Good night, he said. She walked down the corridor of Ravenshire Castle, past the covered portraits, and the closed doors, and the empty vase that had no flowers, and thought about how the most significant moments in the life of a damaged document were never the dramatic ones, never the flood or the fire, or the deliberate removal of pages. They were the quiet ones. The moment when someone patient enough sat down and looked carefully and said, "This is still intact. This is still here. This has survived and it is worth saving." Outside the snow had stopped. The east grounds were very white and very still. And at the edge of the formal garden, just visible at the curve of the path, the uncertain new planting was still there beneath its covering of white, waiting the way. Things wait when they have already decided to grow and are simply gathering the warmth required to begin. Tomorrow, Eleanor thought she would go back into the archive and look for the rest of the truth. She had a feeling there was more of it than anyone had yet found. She was, after all, very good at finding things. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Eleanor was in the archive when Thomas Vale brought it, not to Adrian, which would have been the expected path, but directly to her, which told her something before she had read a single word. Thomas did not do things accidentally. Every choice he made was deliberate, including the choice of who received what information and in what order. He set it on the corner of her table and said, "It came yesterday evening. His Grace has already seen it. I thought you should see it also." Then he left, which was also deliberate. The letter was from a firm of solicitors she did not recognize, Caldwell and Marsh, with a London address, writing on behalf of Lord Evander Pembroke, Earl of Caldmere. The language was formal and precise in the way that formal, precise language is used when the intention behind it is neither formal nor precise. It announced that Lord Pembroke, in his capacity as a concerned member of the peerage and a personal friend of the late James Blackthorne, had gathered significant evidence pertaining to the mismanagement of the Blackthorne family estate and the circumstances surrounding James Blackthorne's financial ruin and subsequent death. A public hearing had been requested before the county magistrate. The date was set for 3 weeks hence. The letter noted, with the specific kind of politeness that functions as a threat, that Lord Pembroke hoped His Grace the Duke of Ravenshire would find it possible to attend and provide a full accounting of his conduct. Eleanor read it twice. Then she set it down and sat very still for a moment, looking at the east wall of the archive, where the restored documents now stood in their new archival housing, labeled stabilized, organized, with the careful attention of someone who understood that order was not merely aesthetic, but structural. Without order, things collapsed into each other. Without the right sequence, meaning became impossible. She thought about Lord Pembroke. She had heard the name once in passing, from Lady Margaret, mentioned in the context of the social landscape of the county. One of several names the older woman had offered as background without particular emphasis. But Eleanor had a memory for details, and she had filed it correctly. Pembroke had been connected to a land negotiation with the Blackthorne estate several years ago. A negotiation that had, according to Lady Margaret's brief mention, not concluded in Pembroke's favor. She thought about the timing. 3 weeks. She picked up her bone folder and went back to work. She found Adrian in the library. He was standing at the window that faced the front grounds, not reading, not working. Simply standing in the particular posture of a man who has been in one position long enough that he has stopped noticing he is in it. He heard her come in, but did not turn immediately, which she had come to understand as his particular form of trust. The willingness to let someone enter his space without immediately managing their impression of him. "You read it," he said. Thomas brought it to me. I asked him to. He turned then. He looked, she thought, as though he had been awake for some portion of the night, though his expression was composed. I wanted your assessment. Of the legal situation or of Pembroke's intentions? Both. Eleanor sat down in the chair near the window, the chair she had come to think of as hers in this room, which was a thought she noted and set aside for later examination. Pembroke has a grievance that predates James's death. The land negotiation, Lady Margaret mentioned it briefly. He wanted the eastern parcel, Adrian said. James refused to sell it. It has been in the Blackthorne family for 2 centuries, and it borders the river, which makes it valuable in ways that go beyond the acreage. He paused. After James died and I took custody of the estate, Pembroke approached me. I refused as well. And now he has found a more efficient method of acquiring what he wants, Eleanor said. If my management of the estate is deemed negligent or criminal, the court has grounds to appoint an administrator. The land could be sold to resolve debts. He said it flatly without inflection. He has been patient. I will give him that. What evidence does he claim to have? The public version of events regarding James's financial situation. Witness statements from people who observed my conduct at the time, people who saw what I intended them to see, which was me appearing to be the cause of the problem. He paused. He has had 2 years to collect testimony from people who were already inclined to believe the worst. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. And Oliver, she said. Adrian's expression did not change, but something beneath it did, the specific shift she had learned to recognize, the deep tectonic movement that happened when the boy's name entered a conversation that was already difficult. Pembroke has made inquiries, he said carefully, about the arrangement under which Oliver resides at Ravenshire. He has suggested through intermediaries that my custody of the child is that a boy whose guardian is under public investigation for financial misconduct might be better served by other arrangements. What other arrangements? Pembroke has a wife, a large household, a spotless reputation. He paused. And the eastern parcel would presumably be a very convenient addition to his estate. The winter light came through the library window and fell across the floor between them in a pale, clear line. Eleanor thought about Oliver standing beside her at the archive table, touching the edge of the old paper with his careful gloved hands. She thought about the note passed to Thomas at breakfast, the first communication in 18 months, small and written on a scrap of paper, and enormous in every way that mattered. She thought about what it would mean for that child to be moved again. To be taken from the uncle who had sacrificed everything to protect him, and installed in a household chosen by a man whose primary interest was a parcel of riverside land. Something settled in Eleanor's chest. Not anger exactly. Something more deliberate than anger. Something that had a shape and a direction. I have been working through the archive, she said. He looked at her. Since we found James's ledger, I have been looking, as I said I would, for anything else, any other documents that were misfiled or removed or concealed. She paused. I have been thorough. And the solicitor's statement in the ledger is not the only document. She held his gaze steadily. There's our 2 other items. The first is a letter from James to his own solicitor, a different one earlier from 4 years ago, in which he asks for advice about a personal loan arrangement. The letter describes the arrangement accurately. It describes your role in it accurately. It is not a confession of his mistakes, but it is a document that places you clearly in the position of the person trying to help, rather than the person causing harm. Adrian was very still. The second is a set of estate transfer records from 3 years ago. They were in a box mislabeled as correspondence from the 1800s, genuinely mislabeled. I believe not deliberately concealed, simply part of the reorganization chaos. They show the specific financial movements at the time of the worst of James's debts. They show your name as the source of funds that resolved the immediate crisis. She paused. Along with the solicitor's formal statement, and along with the letter, the personal one. They constitute a sequential record of events that is considerably clearer than the public version. He did not speak for a moment. Eleanor, he said. I know what I found, she said. I also know what it means. I have spent 3 weeks looking at these documents carefully, And I am telling you that what exists in that archive properly presented is sufficient to tell the true version of events. She paused. What you do with that is still your decision. It has always been your decision. But you are making it now with a different set of facts about what is possible. He turned to the window. She let him have the silence. Outside the grounds were still winter pale, the sky low and gray. The gardens waited. The uncertain planting at the edge of the east path had survived the snow. She could see it from here, small but present, the tentative beginning of something that intended to grow. If the documents are presented at the hearing, he said finally, the true version becomes public. Yes. James's role in it becomes part of the record. Some of it. Enough to establish context. Not I have thought about this carefully. The solicitor's statement describes your conduct clearly, without requiring a full accounting of every decision James made. It is possible to tell the true story in a way that protects the most important parts of his memory. She paused. It would require someone to present it correctly, to understand what each document establishes and how they work together. He turned from the window and looked at her. He said, I found them. I understand their condition and their content and the sequence in which they need to be presented for the argument to hold. She met his eyes. I am also, I believe, a more unexpected choice than a solicitor. Pembroke is preparing for a legal confrontation. He is not preparing for a book restorer from a failing shop on Whitmore Lane. The almost smile, slower than usual, but more complete. You have been planning this, he said. I have been preparing for a possibility, she said carefully. Whether you choose to use it is entirely different. He looked at her for a long moment, the full attentive look that she had first noticed at the banquet, and that had not diminished in the weeks since, the look of someone who was genuinely trying to see something rather than simply confirm what they expected to find. The hearing is in 3 weeks, he said. I know. I will need access to all of the documents for the remainder of the time. And I will need Thomas to help me understand the legal structure of the hearing, so I know how the presentation needs to be ordered. She paused. And you will need to trust me. I already trust you, he said. Quietly, without drama, the way he said things that were simply true. Eleanor breathed. Then let us begin, she said. The 3 weeks that followed were the most concentrated period of work Eleanor had undertaken in her professional life. She rose before the light and worked until after dark. She organized the documents into a sequence that told the story correctly, not the legal story only, but the human one, the one that explained why a man might choose to carry a reputation he did not deserve for reasons that had nothing to do with himself. She prepared summaries. She cross-referenced dates. She made careful notes on the condition and provenance of each item so that no one could question their authenticity. Oliver continued to come to the archive every morning. He did not seem to notice the increased intensity of her work, or if he noticed, he did not find it alarming. He had begun in the past week to sit at the table rather than in his corner, not beside her, but across from her with his own books, the two of them working in parallel in the easy quiet of people who have learned each other's rhythms. On the second week, he had pushed a piece of paper across the table to her. She had looked at it. He had drawn something, a careful, precise drawing of the archive room viewed from his corner. The shelves, the window, the table. A figure at the table that she recognized after a moment as herself. And in the drawing's corner, very small, his own figure. Not outside the room. Inside it. Part of the scene. She had looked at it for a long time. Then she had taken out her pencil and drawn a small addition, a stack of books on the table between their two figures, connecting them, and pushed it back. He had looked at it. And then, for the first time in her presence, he had smiled. She had turned back to her documents immediately, giving him the privacy of the expression. But she carried it with her for the rest of the day, like something she intended to keep. She told Adrian that evening. Not the full story, just, Oliver smiled today. The look on Adrian's face was something she did not have adequate words for, and she did not try. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear. Eleanor dressed with care, not the 4-year-old dress she had worn to the banquet, but the best of the 3 she had brought to Ravenshire, a deep blue that had been her mother's and had been altered twice, and still fit better than anything she had purchased herself. She wore her hair simply without elaboration, because she was not going to the hearing to be noticed for anything except what she was carrying. She met Adrian in the entrance hall. He was dressed formally, dark coat, the careful presentation of a man who understood that appearance was information, that how you walked into a room communicated something before you had spoken a word. He looked, she thought, different from the man she had first seen at the banquet. Not softer, not diminished in any way, but less armored. As though he had made peace with something, and that peace had changed the way he stood. He looked at her. "You do not have to do this," he said. "I know. If it goes badly." "I understand what I am doing," she said. "I have understood it since I started preparing." She paused. "Have you slept?" "Adequately." "That is not yes." The almost smile. "No, it is not." Thomas Vale appeared from the corridor with Eleanor's case. The document case she had packed the previous evening, with the same care she brought to everything, each item wrapped and ordered and labeled for quick access. He handed it to her with the brief nod of someone communicating competence and confidence. "Oliver is with Lady Margaret," Thomas said. "He knows you are going somewhere important. He did not ask questions." A pause. "He did give me something for you." He held out a folded piece of paper. Eleanor opened it. It was a drawing. The same style as the one in the archive. Careful, precise, the particular seriousness of a child who draws as a form of communication rather than entertainment. A figure she recognized as herself, standing in front of what she recognized after a moment as the hearing room she had described to Lady Margaret in passing. Beside the figure, very small but clearly deliberate, he had drawn a stack of books. Underneath, in careful, unpracticed letters, the first words he had written to her directly for the broken things. Eleanor folded the paper and put it in her pocket. She picked up the document case. "Let us go," she said. The county magistrate's hearing room was fuller than it should have been. This told Eleanor everything she needed to know about Pembroke's strategy. A legal proceeding of this nature was not by its nature a public event, but Pembroke had evidently ensured that the right people were informed, the right invitations, extended the right suggestion, made that this was something worth observing. The room held perhaps 60 people, which was 40 more than the proceeding required. Eleanor recognized several faces from the Ravenshire winter banquet. Lady Hargrove, 3 of the women who had been in Clara's circle that evening. Clara herself was not present. Eleanor filed this information without feeling much about it. Lord Pembroke was already positioned at the front of the room, a man of perhaps 60, well-maintained in the way of men who have always had the means to maintain themselves, with the expression of someone who has been quietly certain of an outcome for long enough that the certainty has become indistinguishable from his face. He watched Adrian enter with the specific composure of a man who has already won and is simply waiting for the official confirmation. He did not appear to notice Eleanor. This was, she suspected, about to become relevant. The magistrate, a gray-haired man named Holt, with the expression of someone who had presided over enough proceedings to have developed an immunity to drama, opened the hearing with the standard formalities. Pembroke's solicitor rose and presented the case as they had constructed it, a pattern of financial mismanagement testimony from witnesses who had observed the Duke's conduct at the time of James's difficulties, a narrative of pressure and exploitation dressed in careful legal language. The witnesses were not lying. That was the difficult part. They had seen what they had seen. The problem was not that their testimony was false, it was that it was incomplete. They were describing a picture from which the context had been deliberately removed, and without the context, the picture said something that was not true. Eleanor sat beside Adrian and listened, and took notes, and waited. When Pembroke's solicitor finished and invited a response, Adrian's solicitor, a quiet man named Graves, whom Adrian had engaged specifically for this proceeding, began with the formal counter-argument. He was competent and precise, and Eleanor had spent 2 evenings with him going through every document so that he understood exactly what each piece established. But she had also negotiated something else. Graves paused at a specific point in his presentation and said, "I would like, with the magistrate's permission, to introduce the testimony of a material witness. Miss Eleanor Whitmore is a professional document restorer engaged by the Blackthorn estate." In the course of her work in the estate archives, she has identified several significant documents relevant to these proceedings. Magistrate Holt looked at Eleanor. Pembroke's solicitor began to object. Holt raised a hand. "I will hear the witness." Eleanor stood. She had been in rooms that watched her before. She had been in the center of a ballroom with 200 people waiting for her to fail. She had learned in that experience something important. The watching itself was not the problem. The problem was what you believed the watching meant. She walked to the front of the room. She set the document case on the table and opened it, and she began. She did not perform. She did not elevate her voice or seek dramatic effect. She simply explained in the clear, precise language of her profession what each document was, its provenance, its condition, its date, the chain of custody that established its authenticity, and then what it established. The letter from James to his solicitor 4 years before his death, which described accurately a private loan arrangement with his brother. The estate transfer records showing the source of funds that had resolved the immediate financial crisis. And finally, the formal statement, the witnessed signed testament that James Blackthorne had given to his solicitor 3 months before he died. She read from the statement, carefully selecting the sections that established the facts without exposing more of James's private choices than was necessary to tell the true story. She had thought about this for 3 weeks. She had made deliberate choices about what to present and how. The goal was not total disclosure. The goal was sufficient truth. The room was very quiet by the time she finished. She said, "What these documents establish taken together is a sequential record of events that is materially different from the account presented by the petitioner. They demonstrate that the Duke of Ravenshire did not cause his brother's financial difficulties. He attempted to resolve them at significant personal cost, including the cost of his own public reputation. He accepted, and in some instances actively encouraged, an interpretation of events that placed the responsibility with him rather than with his brother, for reasons that the personal letter within the ledger makes explicit." She paused. "I am not here to characterize Lord Pembroke's intentions in bringing this petition," she said. "I am here because I found these documents in the course of my professional work, and because the truth they contain is relevant to this proceeding." She looked at Magistrate Holt directly. "The truth does not require revenge, my lord. It only needs to be seen." The magistrate reviewed the documents for 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, the room did what rooms do when they are waiting for a verdict that has already been reached and simply needs to be formalized. It reorganized itself. Eleanor could feel it happening without watching it. The quiet recalibration. The particular sound of people revising their assumptions. She sat beside Adrian. He did not say anything, but at a certain point, without particular ceremony, he placed his hand over hers on the table, the same brief gesture as in the archive, the same careful communication of something that did not yet have words, and this time he did not withdraw it. She turned her hand over and held his, just for a moment. Then they separated and returned to the practical business of waiting. Magistrate Holt looked up. He said, "The petition is dismissed." He said several other things after that formal language about the insufficient evidentiary basis for the claims, about the authenticity of the counter documents, about the court's position regarding the custody arrangement at Ravenshire. Eleanor registered all of it, but what she registered most clearly was the moment when Pembroke's solicitor began to rise to object, and Holt looked at him with the specific expression of a man who has presided over enough proceedings to have developed very little patience for people who waste his time with things that have already been decided. The solicitor sat back down. Across the room, Pembroke's composure had done something that was not quite crumbling, but was very close to a controlled collapse. The certainty had gone out of his face. What remained was the expression of a man recalculating, which told Eleanor that this was not over. In the deeper sense that Pembroke was not the kind of man to accept a single setback as a conclusion, but that was a problem for another day. Today had been one. People approached Adrian as they were leaving. This was the part Eleanor had not fully anticipated. Not the legal outcome which she had spent 3 weeks preparing for, but the social aftermath. the people who had watched the hearing. The people from the banquet who had been in the room and had heard the documents read aloud. Lady Hargrove reached them first. She was a woman who had spent a lifetime calculating social positions, and she had calculated something clearly in the past hour, because her manner had shifted from the comfortable condescension of someone who had always held a higher hand to something more careful. "Your Grace," she said to Adrian. Then she looked at Eleanor. She opened her mouth to say something that Eleanor could see was going to be a form of compliment, that was also an attempt to establish connection to position herself as someone who had always seen Eleanor's value, or at least had never actively dismissed it. Eleanor looked at her, not unkindly, simply directly. "Lady Hargrove," she said. Lady Hargrove closed her mouth, opened it again, said, "That was very impressive work, Miss Whitmore." "Thank you," Eleanor said, and left it there. She did not elaborate. She did not offer the social generosity of helping the woman feel better about the evening. They had both been present for the evening when Lady Hargrove's laughter had contributed to the chorus that sent Eleanor across a ballroom floor. That evening existed. What Eleanor did with it was her choice. She chose not to be unkind. She also chose not to pretend it had not happened. Several other people approached. Some of them spoke to Adrian, a few with genuine expressions of something that might be called remorse, though Eleanor thought recalibration was probably more accurate, which was not the same thing as meaningless. Remorse that leads to different behavior is worth something. Adrian received it with the careful dignity of someone who understood that public opinion is a mechanism and not a moral authority, and that this moment of reversal did not obligate him to feel more warmly toward the people experiencing it than the situation warranted. How was gracious. He was not effusive. Eleanor thought it was exactly right. Thomas Vale appeared from the back of the room at some point and spoke quietly with Graves. He caught Eleanor's eye over the gathering of people and gave her a look that communicated in the particular economy of someone who used gestures carefully, something that she translated as well done. She nodded once. They rode back to Ravenshire in a silence that was not the absence of things to say, but the particular fullness of people who have been through something significant together and are letting it settle before they try to speak about it. Eleanor watched the countryside moving past the window. The winter light was already fading the sky, going to the pale gray gold of late afternoon, and the Ravenshire grounds came into view first as a silhouette. The towers, the line of the walls, and then became specific as the carriage turned through the gates. She had a thought looking at it. She had come here to restore old documents. She had done that. She had also, without particularly intending, to done several other things. And she was aware now, in the particular clarity that comes after a long and concentrated effort, that the situation had changed in ways that required some honest examination. She was no longer simply the restoration professional engaged for the archive project. She was not sure exactly what she was. She was aware that this was something she needed to think about carefully and honestly, and without the kind of wishful interpretation that wounded people apply to situations where they very much want something to be true. Adrian was looking at her. "You are thinking," he said. "I am often thinking. You are thinking about something specific." She turned from the window. "I am thinking about what comes next. For the estate. For various things." She paused. "For Oliver. The hearing's outcome secures your custody arrangement, I imagine." "Yes. Graves will confirm the details, but yes. That is resolved." He paused. "For Oliver, I think what comes next is what has been happening in that archive every morning. Continued if possible." She nodded. "For the estate," he said. "There is a great deal of work still to be done, in the archive and in other respects." He looked at her carefully. "I hope I intend to proceed differently from here, more openly. Some of the things I have kept closed should not remain closed. The portraits," she said, "among other things." He looked at his hands. "Oliver is going to have questions. He is going to start asking them when he is ready, and I am going to need to be ready to answer them. Honestly, but carefully. As you said, there is a version of the truth that can be offered when someone is strong enough to hold it." "He is getting stronger," Eleanor said. "I know." A pause. "I saw the drawing he gave you, this morning before you came downstairs." He looked at her. He drew himself inside the room. Yes. He has not drawn himself inside any room until now. His voice was very quiet. He has been drawing since he arrived. The servants noticed it early. All of the drawings were exteriors, buildings, grounds, things viewed from outside. He paused. Always from outside. Eleanor thought about a child who had lost everything, and found the world too uncertain to enter, and had learned very slowly in the quiet of a room full of old paper and careful work that some spaces were safe enough to step into. "The archive will be finished eventually," she said. "Yes. When the restoration work is complete, my professional engagement ends." He looked at her. "That is what I am thinking about," she said, simply, without performance. "The boundary of my work here is coming. And I am trying to decide, I am trying to be honest with myself about what I would like to happen after that boundary is reached, and whether what I would like is realistic." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to ask you something." "Yes." "Will you tell me if the answer is no, directly I mean, without the social management of it? I have never particularly managed things socially." "No," he said. "That is one of the things I—" He paused. "One of many things." He looked at her steadily. "Will you stay?" The carriage had stopped. They were through the gates in front of the castle entrance, and Thomas had already come forward to open the door and was exercising his particular gift for being necessary while being entirely unobtrusive. Eleanor looked at Adrian. "I will need to think about it," she said. "Honestly, I know." "That is not a no." "I know that too," he said, and the almost smile was more complete than she had ever seen it. She stepped out of the carriage. The entrance hall was lit more warmly than she had ever seen it, something she registered, and then understood immediately. Lady Margaret must have instructed the staff, must have anticipated the outcome and prepared for it, must have made the specific decision to have the castle look, when they returned, like somewhere people actually lived. And there at the top of the curved staircase was Oliver. He should have been in the drawing room with Lady Margaret. He had clearly been in the drawing room with Lady Margaret, and had at some point decided that this was not where he needed to be. He stood at the top of the stairs and looked down at them. Adrian looked up at him. Eleanor stepped to the side, a small deliberate movement creating space, giving the two of them the center of the scene. Something passed across Oliver's face. The specific, complicated expression of a child who has been frightened for a long time and has not yet fully learned to trust that the fear was wrong, who is looking at the person who represents everything uncertain and everything safe simultaneously. Then Oliver came down the stairs. Not running, walking carefully, seriously in the way he did everything. He reached the bottom and stood in front of Adrian and looked up at him. Adrian went down on one knee. Eye level. The way he had pulled out the chair at the banquet, the choice that said, "You are worth this specific effort, this particular kind of acknowledgement." Oliver looked at him for a long moment. Then he put his arms around his uncle's neck. Adrian's eyes closed. His arms came around the boy, not tentatively, not carefully, but fully, the way people hold things they have been afraid of losing and have just confirmed they have not lost. Eleanor looked at the empty vase near the entrance, at the covered portraits on the wall, at the closed doors along the corridor. She thought about the garden at the edge of the east grounds, the uncertain planting done alone in the particular way of someone beginning something without knowing if they would be allowed to finish it. She thought it was time perhaps for the rooms to open. She thought it was time for the flowers. The first room opened on a Thursday. Eleanor did not witness it directly. She heard about it from Thomas Vale, who mentioned it in the particular way he mentioned things he considered significant briefly, without elaboration, leaving her to understand the weight of it herself. "His Grace opened the East drawing room this morning," he said, setting her morning tea on the archive table. "Had it aired and the furniture uncovered. Oliver was with him." Eleanor set down her brush. "Which room was it?" she asked, though she already had a feeling she knew. "The one with his mother's portrait," Thomas said. "The large one over the fireplace. The one that was covered." He left without saying anything else, which was exactly right. Eleanor sat for a moment with her hands folded and thought about a man who had spent 18 months covering the faces of the people he had lost because the child in his care was not yet strong enough to look at them. And she thought about what it meant that he had decided on a quiet Thursday morning in early spring that the time had come to uncover them. She thought about Oliver standing in that room, looking up at a portrait of his mother. She did not go to them. That was not her moment to enter. But she held it carefully in the part of herself that kept the things worth keeping, and she went back to work. Spring came to Ravenshire, the way it comes to places that have been very cold for a very long time. Not all at once, but in small accumulating assertions. A week of mornings where the light arrived earlier than expected. The particular quality of mud that means the ground has finally decided to give. And then one afternoon, Eleanor looked out the archive window and saw the edge of the east garden path and understood that the uncertain planting had survived the winter. It was growing, small, still and tentative, but unmistakably present, a row of something green at the boundary of the formal path, pushing up through the dark earth with the specific determination of things that have decided to exist regardless of the conditions. She did not mention it to Adrian that evening. She simply the next morning left a small sketch on the breakfast table, not signed, not labeled, of the east garden corner, the new growth indicated with careful pencil lines. When she came in from the archive at midday, there was a note in its place in handwriting she had studied on 100 documents and knew immediately. It said, "It was supposed to be roses. I was not sure they would take." She put the note in her pocket with Oliver's drawing. Oliver spoke for the first time in the third week of March. Not to Eleanor, she had always understood it would not be to her, and had understood this without any sense of diminishment. She had been a bridge, not a destination. The destination was always Adrian. Thomas told her about it again in his particular way, which was to appear in the archive doorway and say very quietly, "He spoke at dinner last night." Eleanor put down everything she was holding. "What did he say?" she asked. Thomas's expression did something she had never seen it do before. The carefully maintained composure of a man who managed enormous things with enormous efficiency shifted just briefly into something that was simply human. He said, "Uncle, may I have more of the soup?" Thomas paused. Then he said, "It is very good." Eleanor breathed. "His Grace," Thomas continued, said yes, of course, and passed the tureen. He paused again. And then they both pretended it had not been the most significant thing to happen in this house in 18 months and continued with dinner. Eleanor turned back to her work because it was the only way she could think of to contain the feeling properly. She worked for perhaps 20 minutes with hands that were not entirely steady, and she did not mind. Later that afternoon, Oliver came to the archive as usual. He sat across from her at the table. He opened his book. After a while, without looking up, he said, "The roses are coming up." His voice was slightly lower than she had imagined it would be, and more serious, and absolutely his own. "I know," she said in her normal voice, her thinking out loud voice, as though he had always spoken, and this was simply another morning in a long series of mornings. "I have been watching them. My uncle planted them," he said. "In the winter. I saw him from the window, but I did not tell him I saw." "Why not?" Oliver considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. "Because he did not want help. He wanted to do it himself." He turned a page of his book. "Sometimes people need to do things themselves." Eleanor looked at him. "Yes," she said. "They do." Oliver nodded satisfied and went back to his reading. Eleanor went back to hers. The archive was completed in the second week of April. It had taken 4 months and 3 weeks, which was longer than she had estimated at the beginning, and shorter than she had begun to hope for somewhere in the middle, when the work had started to feel like the best thing she had done in her professional life, and she was not entirely ready for it to end. She stood in the finished room on the last afternoon and looked at what she had made. The shelving was organized, labeled, housed in proper archival material that would protect the contents for another century if they were maintained correctly. The damage that could be repaired had been repaired. The damage that could not be reversed had been stabilized and documented, its extent clearly recorded, so that anyone working with these materials in the future would understand what they had and what had been lost. The room smelled of clean paper and beeswax, and the specific quality of old things properly cared for. It was, she thought, the most orderly place she had ever made. She thought about her father's book, the slightly crooked building on Whitmore Lane, the shelves organized by feeling rather than category, the smell of old leather, and the particular sound the door made when it opened. She thought about the debt that had sent her to the Ravenshire banquet in the first place, dressed in a 4-year-old gown and positioned 2 steps behind Clara. She had not thought about the debt in some time. It had been settled. Not by her, which had been the condition she had argued against and lost, because Adrian was a man who, once he had decided something was right, did not find the argument against it particularly compelling. "You found my brother's letter," he had said when they had first discussed it. "You preserved the evidence that changed what was possible for this family. You restored the estate archive. You helped my nephew speak again." He had looked at her steadily. "The bookshop is a very small debt." "It is my debt," she had said. "It is now mine as well," he had said. "That is what it means when a situation concerns both of us." She had been quiet for a moment, processing this. "You said both of us," she said. "Yes. That is a particular kind of statement. I am aware of that." She had not argued further. She had filed it carefully in the place where she kept things that required time to understand properly, and she had let the debt be settled, and she had felt strange about it for approximately 2 weeks before she had decided that the strangeness was the feeling of being allowed to receive something which was not an experience she had a great deal of practice with. She was practicing. She was sitting in this completed archive making her final condition notes when Adrian appeared in the doorway. He looked at the room. She watched him look at it, the full, slow attention he brought to things that mattered to him, the quality of presence that she had learned to recognize as his version of deep feeling. His eyes moved across the shelves, the organized boxes, the careful labels in her handwriting. "It is finished," he said. "Yes." He came into the room and stood at the center of it, turning slowly. She had never seen him that simply turn in a room, taking it in from all angles without an agenda. He looked, she thought, like someone who was allowing himself to be in a place fully rather than passing through it. "My father started this collection," he said. "He used to bring me in here when I was small. He would show me things, letters from 100 years ago, estate records, documents about people who had lived on this land for generations." He touched the spine of one of the newly rehoused ledgers. "He said the archive was the memory of the family. He said if you lost the archive, you lost the story." "He was right," Eleanor said. "He would have liked you." He said it simply, without decoration. He valued people who understood what things were actually worth, rather than what they appeared to be worth. Eleanor looked at her hands. "I need to tell you something," she said. He turned to face her. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what I would like to do next, professionally." She paused, ordering her thoughts in the way she had ordered the archive, carefully, with attention to sequence. "There are women in this county, and beyond it, who have skills that are not recognized and not compensated properly. Some of them work in households. Some of them have learned things from their families that are genuinely valuable. Bookbinding, paper repair, document preservation, textile conservation, and they have no way to formalize that knowledge or use it to support themselves properly." She paused. "I have been thinking about what it would mean to offer them training. Structured instruction. A way to turn what they already know into work that pays." Adrian listened. "I would need a space," she said. "A proper one with good light and storage for materials. And I would need time. It would not happen quickly. The first students would need instruction at every level, which means the first year would be primarily foundational." She looked at him. "I have been drawing up a proposal." "How long have you been drawing it up?" "Since January," she admitted. He looked at her for a moment. Then, "You have been planning for something that requires a permanent base of operation." "Yes. A permanent base that is not a failing bookshop on Whitmore Lane." "The bookshop is no longer failing, as you know." "A permanent base," he continued without the almost smile, but with something in his eyes that was related to it, that would need to be somewhere with sufficient space and an existing archive worth maintaining. "That would be convenient," she agreed. Eleanor. She looked up. He was watching her with the full, steady attention, not the social composure, not the managed distance, the real thing. The version she had first seen at the banquet, when he had looked at her across an empty table and searched for what was actually there. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want to ask it correctly, which means I need to say first that it is not because of what you found in the archive. It is not because of the hearing or what you did there. It is not because of Oliver, though what you have given him is something I will never have adequate words for." He paused. "It is none of those things." Eleanor was very still. "At the banquet," he said, "you crossed a room full of people who had decided I was to be avoided, and when you sat down the first thing you said to me was an apology. Not for yourself, for the disruption. As though your only concern in that moment was whether you had inconvenienced me." He paused. "I had not been treated with that kind of simple consideration in longer than I could accurately remember. You did not know who I was in any meaningful sense. You only knew the reputation, and you set it aside and treated me like a person." Eleanor breathed. "You treated me," he said, "like a man before you knew I was a duke, and that is something I did not know I had been waiting for until I received it, and I have not stopped thinking about it since." The archive was very quiet around them. The April light came through the north window in the clear, specific way it had when she had first stood in this room in December, and understood immediately that it was the right light for the work. She thought about 27 years of being perfectly adequate. She thought about the chair he had pulled out for her at the banquet. Not the compliment, but the gesture. The deliberate public acknowledgement of someone who had walked across a room that everyone was afraid of and deserved to be received properly. She thought about a note that said it was supposed to be roses and a drawing of a garden corner, and the specific strange practice of being allowed to receive something. She thought about what her father had written on the shelves of his bookshop. Books that change you. She had always thought of that as a category for books. She understood now it was a broader category than that. "I would like to propose," Adrian said, and his voice was quiet and entirely without performance, "that you stay. Not as the restoration professional, not as the person who saved the archive or the hearing or any particular thing, but as the person you are, which is someone I would very much like to continue knowing for the rest of my life." He reached into his coat. The ring was simple, a deep blue stone, dark as water set in plain gold. Not elaborate. Not the kind of thing designed to announce itself, the kind of thing designed to last. "You told me," he said, "that you were not doing what you did to be thanked. I know that. I am not asking you because of gratitude." He held it out. "I am asking because you are the first room I have wanted to stay in for a very long time." Eleanor looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about all the things she might say, all the careful, measured things she had trained herself to say, in situations where the feeling was larger than she knew what to do with. She thought about all the ways she might qualify and consider and process and examine. She thought about a woman who survived by staying unnoticed. She decided she was finished with that woman. "Yes," she said. They told Oliver before they told anyone else. How was in the east drawing room when they found him, the room that had been opened on the Thursday morning in early spring, the one with his mother's portrait above the fireplace. He had taken to spending time there in the late afternoons, sometimes simply sitting and looking at the portrait, sometimes drawing, sometimes reading. It was, Eleanor thought, his version of the careful work she did in the archive, sitting with something difficult until it became possible to be in the same room with it. Adrian told him simply, "I have asked Eleanor to marry me. She has agreed." Oliver looked at Eleanor. Then he looked at Adrian. Then he said in the serious, considered way he said everything, "Will she still be in the archive?" "The archive will always be there," Eleanor said, "and I am not going anywhere." Oliver looked at her for a long moment, with the dark, direct eyes that saw things clearly and had stopped needing to seal themselves against what they found. "Good," he said. Then he went back to his drawing. Adrian caught Eleanor's eye over the top of the boy's head, and she saw the thing she had first glimpsed in the corridor of the castle months ago. Closer to the surface, now no longer pressed down by the weight of all the things he had been carrying alone. The thing that looked, when it had room to be itself, remarkably like joy. The Restoration Academy opened in September. Eleanor had spent the spring and summer converting 3 rooms in the castle's West Wing rooms that had been empty and maintained but unused, waiting for a purpose they had not yet been given. The light in the West Wing was good in the mornings. The space was generous. The existing storage adapted well to the material requirements of the work. The first students were 6 women. 2 of them came from households in the county, a laundress who had learned bookbinding from her mother and had been practicing it privately for years with no way to formalize the skill. A woman who had worked in a estate library for a decade and understood document care better than most professionals Eleanor had encountered but had no credentials and no recognition. 2 more came from the town. A young woman who had been working in a print shop and understood paper in ways she had never been taught to articulate, and her younger sister who had no prior experience but an attention to detail that Eleanor recognized immediately as the foundational quality from which everything else could be built. The remaining 2 were referred by Lady Margaret, who had characteristically efficiently with the strategic deployment of existing social connections, made it quietly known among the county's charitable organizations that there was a program worth directing the right people toward. Eleanor taught them the way she had learned not through lecture, but through presence, through sitting beside them while they worked and asking questions that led them to find the answers rather than simply receiving information. Through treating what they already knew as a foundation worth building on, rather than a gap worth correcting. She taught them the way she had been with Oliver in the archive. The work itself as the lesson. The quiet as the method. By November, 2 of the students had taken on small private commissions, household families in the county, with damaged documents, who had been referred by Thomas Vale, who had quietly and efficiently become the Academy's first external advocate. By the following spring, there was a waiting list. The Ravenshire Winter Banquet was held in December, as it always was. The invitations went out 6 weeks in advance, as they always did. The conversation in drawing rooms across the county focused on attendance and seating arrangements and what one ought to wear, as it always had. The difference was in who issued the invitations. Adrian had sent them under both their names, the Duke of Ravenshire and Eleanor, Duchess of Ravenshire, in the plain, clear way. He did things when he had decided they were right and saw no reason to be uncertain about them. Eleanor had looked at the printed cards when they came back from the stationer and had felt something. She was still learning the name for the specific sensation of a life rearranging itself into a configuration you had not known was possible until you were in it. She dressed on the evening of the banquet in a gown that was not 4 years old. It was deep blue, the same color as the stone in her ring, which she had chosen without discussing it with Adrian, and which he had noticed immediately and said nothing about, because it was the kind of thing that did not require comment. The gown had been made for her properly, which was a thing she had very little practice with. Things made for her specifically fitted to her actual measurements, designed with no one else's requirements in mind. She stood in front of the glass in the room that was now entirely her own, which was to say, their room, which was the large one in the south wing, with the windows that caught both morning and evening light, which Adrian had suggested, and she had agreed to, and which had taken her approximately 3 weeks to stop finding surprising, and looked at herself. The woman in the glass was the same woman who had stood in this county a year ago in a 4-year-old dress and been pushed into the center of a ballroom as a joke. She was also entirely different. Not because of the gown, not because of the ring or the title or the name on the invitation. Those were circumstances. Circumstances were not the same as change. The change was in how she stood. The change was in the quality of the looking the way she met her own eyes in the glass, without immediately cataloging the ways she fell short of some external measure she had long since stopped believing in. The change was in the feeling that had replaced the practiced skill of invisibility, not its opposite, not loudness or display, but something quieter and more durable. The knowledge that she was worth being seen. She picked up her gloves and went downstairs. Adrian was waiting in the entrance hall. The portraits were all uncovered now, had been since spring, when Adrian and Oliver had gone through the castle together on a quiet Sunday afternoon and taken down every gray cloth. Eleanor had not been there for it. It had been their work to do uncle and nephew the careful act of bringing the faces of the lost back into the light of the living. She had seen the results after, had walked through the castle and looked at the portraits properly for the first time at the faces of the Blackthorn family across 3 centuries. She had found the one of James painted perhaps a decade before his death, younger than she had imagined him, with the same dark eyes as Oliver, and an expression that managed to be both warm and slightly uncertain, as though he had not quite decided if the painter could be trusted. She had stood in front of it for a long while. She had thought about what he had written. "You were always better than I deserved in a brother." She had thought he knew. At the end he knew. She thought it was enough. Not everything. Not all that might have been wished for, but enough. Adrian looked at her as she came down the stairs. He had the full, steady attention, the one that saw what was actually there. "You look," he said, and then he stopped, which was unlike him, because he was careful with words, and usually only stopped when he had decided the word he intended was not quite right. "You look like yourself," he said finally. She understood what he meant. "Shall we go?" she said. He offered his arm. The Ravenshire ballroom had not changed. This was one of the things about rooms, they did not change simply because the people in them had. The same marble floors, the same high ceilings, the same arrangement of tables and candlelight, and the particular acoustics that made the music sound slightly more grand than it was. The same winter cold just beyond the tall windows. The same warmth within. What had changed was everything else. Eleanor felt it before she was fully through the door. The shift in the room's attention, the specific change in the quality of the air that happens when someone enters a space, and the space reorganizes itself around them. Not the watching and waiting of the previous year. Not the audience gathering for a humiliation. Something different. Something that took her a moment to identify, because she had not experienced it directed at herself before. Recognition. Lady Margaret was already there near the fireplace in conversation with 2 women Eleanor recognized from the County Magistrate Society. She caught Eleanor's eye and made the small, precise gesture that was her version of acknowledgement. Not a wave, not an exclamation, but a slight lift of her chin that communicated several things simultaneously, none of which required elaboration. Thomas Vale was there as well. He attended the banquet in his capacity as estate manager, a position that had never required social participation, and had this year been entirely transformed by his unofficial role as the Restoration Academy's primary external liaison. He stood near the entrance and looked at Eleanor as she entered, and did the thing with the corner of his mouth that she had come to treasure. She nodded at him. And then the room did something she had not anticipated. People stood. Not all at once. It began near the door and moved through the room, the way these things move, one person rising, and then the person beside them, and then outward, until the movement had reached most of the room. Not everyone. Some people were still recalibrating, still processing the year of changed information and shifted social positions, and she did not hold it against them. Recalibration takes time. She understood that better than most. But enough. Enough people rising without being asked, without anyone having organized it in the spontaneous way that things happen when enough individuals make the same quiet decision simultaneously. Lady Hargrove was among them. She met Eleanor's eyes as she rose, and Eleanor held the look for a moment, the same direct, uncomplicated look she had given the woman at the hearing. Not unkind, not forgiving in the performative sense that requires the other person to understand they have been forgiven. Simply present. Simply honest. Lady Hargrove looked for the first time in Eleanor's experience of her slightly uncertain. Eleanor thought this was probably good for her. She felt Adrian's hand at her back, the familiar light pressure that communicated presence without claim, the gesture of someone who had learned the difference between holding on and holding steady. She thought about crossing this room a year ago. The sound of the music stopping. Her heels on the marble. The practiced steadiness of hands that wanted to shake but had been told they would not. She thought about a chair. The finest chair in the room. Pulled out by a man everyone called a monster, who had stood up because the alternative was to let someone feel diminished for the act of crossing a room, and he had not been willing to do that. She thought about how that gesture had been the first true thing she had known about him. Before the archive, before the child, before the letter in the binding, and the roses in the garden, and the note that said it was supposed to be roses before any of that. There had been a man who saw someone walk toward him when everyone expected her to be sent away, and he had stood up and offered her the best seat in the room. Not because of her beauty, not because of her name, not because of what she could do for him, because she had walked across the room, because the act itself had been worth acknowledging, because he had been underneath everything a man who understood worth when he saw it, especially when no one else was bothering to look. Adrian moved forward. He walked toward her, not taking her arm, not leading her in, simply walking beside her, the two of them moving through the room together, through the standing people, and the candlelight, and the music that had begun again in the particular way music begins again when the room has decided to return to itself. They reached the far end of the hall. The table was set for 12 this year. Every seat occupied or spoken for, except one. He stopped beside it. The chair on his left, the best position angled toward the warmth, placed where the candlelight landed cleanly. Not the chair he had pulled out for her last year, because last year there had been 2 people at a table for 12, and the choice had been which of the empty seats she would take. This time the choice was different. He stood beside the chair and looked at her. He did not say, "Sit here." He did not take her arm and direct her. He did not indicate with a gesture or an expression what the correct answer was. He simply waited, giving her the choice. She looked at the chair. She looked at him. She thought about a woman who had spent 27 years staying at the edges of rooms, practiced in the skill of not occupying space. Expert in the art of being useful without being present. Present invisibility worn like armor against the specific pain of being seen and found lacking. She thought about what it had cost her to cross this room a year ago. She thought about what it had given her. She sat down, in the chair beside him. The same chair, the best one. Not because anyone had placed her there, not because circumstance had pushed her to it. Not as a joke or a test or a cruel entertainment, arranged by someone with a champagne glass and a talent for casual cruelty. Because she had chosen it. Because she knew now, in the way you know things that have been earned rather than given, that she had always deserved to choose it. Adrian sat beside her. The table filled. The candles burned. The music moved through the room with the ease of something that had found its proper tempo. And around them, in the particular way that social worlds reorganize themselves when enough truth has been released into them, the Ravenshire winter banquet proceeded into its evening richer. She thought for the honesty that had been introduced into it, however painfully, over the course of the year. Lady Margaret caught her eye across the table and raised her glass very slightly. Eleanor raised hers in return. Thomas Vale, from his position near the wall, was watching the room with the expression of someone confirming a conclusion he had reached months ago and found in the confirmation considerable satisfaction. Oliver was not there. He was at home with the governess. He had finally accepted, probably drawing something at the table in the east drawing room under his mother's portrait, or reading in the archive by lamplight, or standing at the window, looking at the garden where the roses had come up and would in the spring be there again. She thought about what he had written on the piece of paper he had given her before the hearing. For the broken things. She thought about her father and his bookshop, and the shelves organized by feeling rather than category. She thought about books that change you, and how she had once thought that was a category for books, and had since discovered it was a category for everything. For people, for choices. For a single gesture made across a room on a winter night by a man nobody expected to be kind. She thought about what it meant to repair something, not to make it what it had been before. That was not possible. Damage was real, and its effects persisted, and there was no restoration method that erased the history of what a thing had survived. But you could stabilize it. You could stop the ongoing deterioration. You could rehouse it in something strong enough to last, and you could return it to use, and you could ensure that the story it contained was legible to the people who needed to read it. You could make it so that broken did not mean finished. You could make it so that what had survived was recognized as exactly that, a thing that had chosen against considerable odds to survive. She looked at the man beside her, the man who had stood up in this room when everyone expected him to stay seated, who had planted roses in winter without knowing if they would take, who had carried his brother's pain and his nephew's grief and his family's honor in the particular silence of someone who had decided that his own suffering was the correct price for everyone else's peace. and she thought, he will not do that anymore. Not because she had fixed him. Not because love was a restoration method that erased the history of what a person had survived. But because the archive of him was in order now. The damage was documented, and the stable parts were identifiable, and the sequence of the story could be read correctly by anyone patient enough to look. And he had found at last someone who was. "Are you thinking?" Adrian said quietly close. "Yes." "About what?" She looked at the room, the candlelight and the music, and the people who had stood, and the people who were still recalibrating, and Thomas Vale near the wall, and Lady Margaret with her raised glass, and the winter night pressing gently at the tall windows. She looked at him. "About how much I like this chair," she said. He looked at her. The almost smile arrived, and this time it completed itself entirely. Not almost, not the consideration of a smile, but the real thing, genuine and unmanaged, the version she had been glimpsing for months, and now had in full, bright and human, and entirely his. "Good," he said. The music played on. The candles burned. The night was cold and clear outside the windows of the Ravenshire ballroom, and inside the woman who had once been sent across this room as a joke, sat in the finest chair as her own choice beside the man everyone had feared in the life she had not known she was walking toward when she had lifted her chin and crossed the floor. She had come to Ravenshire to restore old things. She had not expected to restore herself in the process. But then, that was the truth about careful work. You sat with something long enough, and you paid it enough attention, and you were patient with the damage and honest about the structure beneath it. And somewhere along the way, in the quiet of the work, you discovered that you had been the object of the restoration all along. She picked up her glass. She thought briefly, and with great clarity, about what her father had always said when she brought a finished restoration to him. Every document, every repaired binding, every stabilized letter that had been on the edge of being lost and was now safe. He would look at it for a long time, and then he would say simply, "There it is. There it always was." She set the glass down. There she was. There she had always been.